Some men ride home to bury the past. Lucas Merrick rode home to face the woman he should have married 6 years ago, the widow who now survived on land his father secretly protected, carrying secrets that would shatter everything Lucas thought he knew about love, loyalty, and the legacy bleeding through his hands. In 1876, Red Willow Valley held more than memories. It held the truth about why he ran, why she stayed, and why his father's dying wish wasn't forgiveness. It was a warning. Before we begin, tell me in the comments what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story of love and redemption travels. The train lurched to a stop with a screech of metal against metal, and Lucas Merrick stepped onto the platform of Red Willow Station with the weight of 6 years pressing against his chest like a stone. The air smelled of coal smoke and pine, familiar and foreign all at once, and he stood there for a moment, his leather saddlebag hanging from one shoulder, his wide-brimmed hat casting a shadow across a face that had grown harder since he'd last seen this town. Red Willow Valley had changed. The station itself was new, brick and iron, where there had once been nothing but a dirt road and a hitching post. The railroad had come through 2 years prior, according to the telegram that had reached him in Dodge City, and with it had come progress, commerce, and the kind of people who wore clean collars and talked about futures instead of surviving winters. Lucas didn't trust progress. Progress had a way of paving over the things that mattered. He adjusted the brim of his hat and started walking, boots heavy on the wooden planks. The town spread out before him like a memory he'd tried to drown in whiskey and distance. Main Street with its row of storefronts, the church steeple rising white against the spring sky, the livery stable where he'd once broken his first horse under his father's unforgiving eye. Everything looked smaller than he remembered, as if the years had shrunk it down to something manageable. But Lucas knew better. Some things didn't shrink. Some things just waited. The telegram had been brief. Father deceased. Estate requires settlement. Return immediately. No condolences, no sentiment. Just the cold facts delivered by the family lawyer, a man named Brennan, whom Lucas had never met but already resented. His father, Josiah Merrick, had been many things. Stubborn, proud, unmovable as the mountains that ringed the valley. But he had also been the man who'd driven Lucas away with words sharp enough to cut bone, and now he was gone, leaving behind land, cattle, and a silence that Lucas wasn't sure he could bear to fill. He passed the general store and caught sight of his reflection in the window. A man in dusty trail clothes, face weathered by sun and hard living, eyes that had seen too much and trusted too little. He barely recognized himself. The boy who'd left Red Willow had been soft in ways that mattered. The man who'd returned was something else entirely. Lucas Merrick. The voice came from behind him, low and cautious. Lucas turned to find Tom Winters standing in the doorway of the feed store, a man in his 40s with graying hair and the kind of face that had spent too many years trying to stay neutral in a town full of feuds. Tom had been his father's foreman once, before Lucas had left. "Didn't think we'd see you again." "Didn't think I'd come back," Lucas said. His voice was rougher than he intended, scraped raw by years of shouting over cattle drives and campfire smoke. "But here I am?" Tom nodded slowly, his gaze traveling over Lucas like he was assessing a horse at auction. "Your father. He was a hard man, but he built something here. Ranch is still standing. Cattle are strong. You'll have your hands full." "I'm not staying," Lucas said flatly. "Just here to settle the estate. Sign the papers. Sell if I have to." Tom's expression shifted, something between surprise and disappointment. "Sell the Merrick Ranch? Your father would roll over in his grave." "My father," Lucas said, his jaw tightening, "stopped having a say in my life the day he told me to choose between this land and—" He stopped himself, the words catching like thorns in his throat. He wasn't going to talk about her. Not here. Not with Tom Winters looking at him like he was a puzzle missing pieces. Tom cleared his throat. "Well, Brennan's expecting you at the office. Papers are ready." "But Lucas—" He hesitated, then pushed forward anyway. "There are things you need to know. About your father. About what he did in the years after you left." Lucas felt something cold settle in his gut. "I'm not interested in his confessions." "Maybe you should be." Tom's voice dropped lower, almost conspiratorial. "He wasn't the man you remember. Not at the end." Lucas didn't answer. He turned and kept walking, his boots striking the boardwalk in a steady rhythm, putting distance between himself and the questions that threatened to crack open the shell he'd built around himself. He didn't want to know who his father had become. He didn't want to know if the old man had regretted the words that had shattered their family. Regret didn't change history. It didn't bring back lost years. It didn't undo the night Lucas had ridden out of Red Willow with nothing but rage and heartbreak and the bitter taste of his father's ultimatum still burning in his mouth. Choose the land or choose her. You can't have both. He'd chosen freedom, and it had felt like dying. The lawyer's office sat at the end of Main Street, a narrow building wedged between the bank and a dressmaker's shop. Lucas pushed through the door and found himself in a room that smelled of paper and old tobacco, walls lined with legal books that nobody read, and a desk buried under documents that looked like they'd been breeding. A thin man with spectacles and thinning hair looked up from his work, his expression carefully neutral. "Mr. Merrick," Brennan said, rising from his chair with the kind of formal politeness that made Lucas's skin itch. "I'm glad you received my telegram. Please, sit." Lucas remained standing. "Let's make this quick. I've got no interest in dragging this out." Brennan adjusted his spectacles, a nervous habit that Lucas immediately cataloged as weakness. "I understand this is difficult. Losing a parent is never easy, even when the relationship was complicated." "You don't know anything about my relationship with my father," Lucas said, his voice flat and final. "Perhaps not," Brennan conceded. He shuffled through the papers on his desk, pulling out a thick folder bound with string. "But I do know the terms of his will, and I suspect they will come as something of a surprise." Lucas's eyes narrowed. "What kind of surprise?" Brennan untied the string and opened the folder, revealing page after page of dense legal text. "Your father left everything to you. The ranch, all 12,000 acres. The cattle, the house, the mineral rights. Every asset he possessed." He paused, glancing up at Lucas over the rim of his spectacles. "But there are conditions." Of course there were. Josiah Merrick had never done anything without strings attached, without leverage, without some way to control the outcome even from beyond the grave. Lucas felt anger flare hot in his chest. What conditions? "You must take residence at the ranch for a minimum of 1 year before you can sell or transfer any part of the property. You must maintain the operations, the cattle, the land, the business relationships your father established. And—" Brennan hesitated, his finger tracing a line of text as if to confirm what he was about to say. "You must personally oversee the fulfillment of certain obligations your father incurred in the final years of his life." "What obligations?" Brennan pulled out another document, this one a letter written in his father's familiar, angular handwriting. "Your father entered into several agreements with neighboring landholders. Grazing rights, water access, financial support for families affected by the war. He was—" Brennan seemed to search for the right word. "Generous in ways that surprised many people." Lucas felt like he'd been punched. Generous? Josiah Merrick? The man who'd ruled his ranch like a tyrant, who'd driven off anyone who challenged him, who'd refused to bend even when bending might have saved his only son from leaving. "You're telling me my father became a philanthropist?" "I'm telling you he changed," Brennan said quietly. "After you left, something shifted in him. He became softer, perhaps, more aware of the damage that pride can do." Lucas turned away, staring out the window at the street beyond. The afternoon sun slanted through the glass, casting long shadows across the boardwalk. Somewhere out there, beyond the town limits and the new railroad and the false veneer of progress, was the ranch. His father's kingdom, his inheritance, his prison. "There's something else," Brennan said, and Lucas heard the hesitation in his voice, the careful way he was choosing his words. "One of the families your father supported, it was the Caldwells." The name hit Lucas like a fist to the gut. He went very still, every muscle in his body locking down. His breath caught somewhere between his lungs and his throat. "What?" "Sarah Caldwell," Brennan continued, and Lucas heard the rustle of papers, the lawyer's nervous movements as he prepared to deliver news that he clearly understood would detonate like dynamite. "She returned to Red Willow 4 years ago, after her husband was killed in the Indian Wars. She inherited a small parcel of land from her mother's estate, About 80 acres on the eastern edge of your father's property. She's been struggling to make it work. Your father, he helped her, quietly. Loans for seed and livestock, access to water rights. He never told anyone, but it's all documented here. Lucas couldn't breathe, couldn't think. The room seemed to tilt around him, the floor unstable beneath his boots. Sarah Caldwell. The woman he'd loved with the kind of intensity that burned everything else away. The woman his father had forbidden him to marry, calling her family trash, and beneath the Merrick name. The woman Lucas had walked away from because he'd been young and stupid and so goddamned angry that he couldn't see past his own pride. She was here. She'd been here for 4 years. And his father, the same man who'd driven Lucas away to prevent their union, had been helping her survive. Why? Lucas's voice came out hoarse, barely above a whisper. Why would he do that? Brennan was quiet for a long moment. Then he reached into the folder and pulled out an envelope, yellowed with age, sealed with wax that bore his father's mark. He left this for you. He said you'd understand when you were ready. Lucas took the envelope with hands that weren't quite steady. His name was written across the front in his father's handwriting, bold and certain. He stared at it, this final message from a dead man, and felt something crack inside him, something he'd thought was already broken beyond repair. I need to see the ranch, he said abruptly, shoving the letter into his coat pocket without opening it. Today. Now. Brennan nodded, clearly relieved to move on from the emotional minefield they'd been navigating. Of course. I can arrange for someone to take you out. I'll ride. Lucas was already moving toward the door, his mind racing ahead of his body, trying to outrun the flood of memories and questions and the terrible, crushing weight of what he'd just learned. I remember the way. He left the office and walked directly to the livery stable where he paid for a horse, a sturdy bay gelding with good legs and an even temperament. He didn't own anything anymore. Not really. Everything he'd carried with him for 6 years fit in a single saddlebag. No home. No roots. Just the clothes on his back and the ghosts that followed him like shadows. The ride out to the ranch took an hour, following the old road that wound through pine forests and across meadows just beginning to green with spring grass. Lucas knew every turn, every landmark, even after all these years. There was the creek where he'd learned to fish. There was the stand of aspens where he'd kissed Sarah for the first time, both of them 16 and terrified and absolutely certain they'd found something that would last forever. Forever had lasted exactly 4 years before his father had ended it with a single ultimatum. The ranch came into view as he crested the final hill, a sprawling operation of corrals and barns and outbuildings, the main house sitting like a fortress at the center of it all. It was a 2-story structure built from local timber and stone, solid and imposing, designed to withstand anything the valley could throw at it. Lucas had grown up in that house. He'd learned to read in the study, learned to ride in the corrals, learned that love was weakness and weakness was death in the long winter of his 17th year when his mother had died and his father had turned to stone. He dismounted and stood there holding the reins, staring at the place that had shaped him and scarred him in equal measure. The front door opened and a woman emerged, older, gray-haired, wearing a simple dress and an apron dusted with flour. Mrs. Hattie Morrison, the housekeeper who'd been with the family since before Lucas was born. Lord have mercy, she breathed, pressing one hand to her chest. Lucas Merrick, I thought I died and was seeing ghosts. Lucas managed a smile, thin and strained. Not a ghost, Hattie, just a man who should have stayed away. She came down the porch steps and stood before him, her eyes searching his face with the kind of maternal assessment that made him feel 16 again. You look like hell, boy. Feel like it too. He tied the horse to the rail and followed her up onto the porch. House looks the same. Your father didn't change much after you left. Kept things the way they were, like he was waiting. She pushed open the door and led him inside into the familiar dimness of the front hall with its worn rugs and dark wood paneling. He talked about you, you know, especially toward the end. Lucas stopped walking. I don't want to hear it. Well, you're going to, Hattie said firmly, turning to face him with the kind of steel that had kept the Merrick household running through decades of masculine stubbornness. Because that man spent the last years of his life trying to make amends for the mistakes he made. And whether you like it or not, you were his biggest regret. The words landed like punches, each one striking against the armor Lucas had built around himself. He had a hell of a way of showing it. Pride's a terrible thing, Hattie said quietly. It makes men do damage they can't undo. Your father knew that. He knew what he'd done to you driving you away. He knew what he'd done to... She stopped herself, but Lucas knew exactly what she'd been about to say. Sarah, he finished for her, the name rough on his tongue. Hattie's expression softened into something like pity. He tried to make it right, Lucas. After you left, after she came back, he tried. Lucas pulled the sealed envelope from his pocket and held it up. Brennan gave me this, said my father wanted me to understand. Then maybe you should read it, Hattie suggested gently, before you make up your mind about everything. Lucas stared at the envelope, at his name written in his father's hand, and felt the weight of 6 years pressing down on him like a landslide. He'd come here to settle an estate, to sign papers and walk away, to finally put Red Willow Valley and everything it represented behind him for good. But now, standing in the house where he'd grown up, holding a letter from a dead man who'd apparently become someone else in the years after Lucas left, he wasn't sure of anything anymore. He broke the seal and unfolded the letter. His father's handwriting sprawled across the page, less steady than Lucas remembered, the hand of a man who'd been ill, who'd been dying, who'd known his time was running out. Lucas, if you're reading this, I'm gone, and you've come home. I don't expect forgiveness. I don't deserve it. What I did to you, what I said to you the night you left, it haunts me still. I told you to choose between this land and the girl you loved, and I told myself it was for your own good, that you were too young to understand what you'd be giving up. But the truth is darker than that, and you deserve to know it. Your mother and I, we weren't always as you remember us. When we were young, we were like you and Sarah, wild with it, certain we'd found something that couldn't be touched. But her family didn't approve. They said I was beneath her, that I'd never amount to anything. They tried to keep us apart, and it nearly destroyed her. We ran away together, eloped, and by the time we came back, the damage was done. Her family never forgave her. She lost everything, her inheritance, her place in society, the love of her own parents. She never blamed me. But I saw what it cost her. I saw how she withered in that isolation, how she grew sad in ways I couldn't fix. And when you came to me with Sarah, when you told me you wanted to marry her, all I could see was history repeating. I thought I was protecting you from the same pain. I thought if I made you choose, you'd see reason. I was wrong. You chose freedom, and I lost my son. Sarah married a soldier and lost her future, and I spent the rest of my days watching what my pride had destroyed. When she came back, widowed and struggling, I knew I had to make it right. I couldn't undo what I'd done to you, but I could help her. I could make sure she had a chance at the life she deserved. I'm telling you this because I need you to understand the land means nothing without someone to share it with. The Merrick name means nothing if it's built on the graves of the people we love. I drove you away to preserve a legacy, and in doing so I destroyed the only thing that mattered. Don't make my mistakes, son. Don't let pride steal your second chance. Whatever you decide about this land, about the ranch, about your future, make sure it's a choice you can live with. And if you see Sarah, if you get the chance to speak to her, tell her I'm sorry. Tell her that in the end I understood what I'd taken from both of you. Your father. Lucas read the letter twice, then a third time, the words blurring as something hot and painful built behind his eyes. He folded it carefully and put it back in his pocket, his hands shaking slightly, his breath unsteady. He loved her mother, Hattie said softly. She'd been watching him from the doorway, giving him space but staying close enough to catch him if he fell. Your grandmother, Josephine Hartford, she was from one of the old East Coast families, came west with her parents when they invested in mining. Your father was just a ranch hand then, nobody special, but they fell in love anyway. He never told me, Lucas said, his voice hollow. He never told anyone. It was his shame, you see. He'd taken her away from everything, and he watched it kill her slowly. By the time you came along, he was so bound up in guilt and regret that he couldn't see straight. And when you wanted Sarah, Hattie trailed off, shaking her head. He saw himself. He saw history. And he panicked. Lucas walked to the window and stared out at the valley, at the land that had been both kingdom and cage for 3 generations of Merrick men. The sun was starting to sink toward the western mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and amber, and somewhere out there, beyond the borders of his father's property, was Sarah Caldwell. Sarah, who'd married someone else. Sarah, who'd lost her husband to war. Sarah, who'd come home to struggle and survive on 80 acres that should have been part of something bigger, something shared. Sarah, who'd been helped by the same man who'd driven Lucas away to prevent their union. The irony was brutal enough to draw blood. "Where is she?" Lucas asked. "Her land. Where is it?" Hattie came to stand beside him, pointing toward the eastern edge of the valley where the foothills began to rise. "Beyond the creek, up near Copper Ridge. It's rough country. Not much good for cattle, but she's trying to make it work. Got a small herd, some chickens, a garden. She's alone out there except for a hired hand who comes twice a week." Alone. The word echoed in Lucas's mind like a bell tolling. Sarah Caldwell, who'd once dreamed of a life filled with children and laughter and a love that would outlast the mountains, was alone on 80 acres of hard ground, surviving on the charity of a dead man who'd destroyed her chance at happiness. "I need to see her," Lucas said, the words coming out before he'd fully decided to speak them. Hattie's hand touched his arm, gentle but firm. "Maybe wait until morning. Give yourself time to—" "No." Lucas turned to face her, and whatever she saw in his expression made her step back. "I've waited 6 years. I'm not waiting another night." He left the house and rode east, following the creek as the light faded and the stars began to emerge like pinpricks in the darkening sky. The land here was rougher, studded with rocks and scrub pine, the kind of territory that required twice the work for half the yield. It was exactly the kind of place someone would end up if they had nowhere else to go and no one to help them. He found the cabin as full dark settled over the valley, a small structure built from rough-hewn logs with a stone chimney leaking smoke into the night air. There was a corral with perhaps a dozen cattle, a chicken coop, a vegetable garden protected by a low fence. It was humble, hardscrabble, the kind of operation that required constant vigilance just to survive. Lucas dismounted and tied his horse to a post, his heart hammering against his ribs like it was trying to escape. He'd faced down stampedes and outlaws and winters that could freeze a man solid, but standing here, about to knock on Sarah Caldwell's door after 6 years of silence, was the most terrifying thing he'd ever done. He raised his hand, knocked twice, and waited. The door opened slowly, cautiously, and then there she was. Sarah Caldwell looked like a dream he'd been trying to forget and a nightmare he couldn't escape all at once. She was still beautiful, heartbreakingly so, but the softness he remembered had been worn away by hardship and loss. Her dark hair, which she'd once worn long and loose, was pulled back in a practical braid. Her face, which had been round with youth, had sharpened into something more angular, more defined. Her eyes, those same green eyes that had haunted him across 6 years and 1,000 miles, widened with recognition, and then something else. Something that looked like pain. "Lucas," she breathed, and his name on her lips after all this time felt like absolution and damnation in equal measure. "Hello, Sarah," he said, and his voice cracked on her name like he was 16 again and hadn't yet learned how to protect himself from the things that could destroy him. They stood there, separated by a threshold and 6 years of silence, and Lucas realized that every mile he'd ridden, every town he'd drifted through, every woman he'd tried to replace her with, all of it had been leading back to this moment, back to her, back to the choice he'd made and the price they'd both paid. "I heard you were back," Sarah said finally, her voice carefully neutral, giving nothing away. "For your father's estate." "That's right." "I'm sorry for your loss." The formal words hung between them, hollow and insufficient. Lucas wanted to laugh, wanted to scream, wanted to tell her that his father's death was the least of what he'd lost, that the real loss had happened 6 years ago when he'd ridden away from her without looking back. "Can I come in?" he asked instead. "We need to talk." Sarah hesitated, and in that hesitation, Lucas saw everything she wasn't saying, the hurt, the anger, the walls she'd built to survive his absence. Then she stepped back, opening the door wider, and he entered her small cabin with its simple furnishings and the smell of wood smoke and something cooking on the stove. She moved to the small table and gestured to one of the 2 chairs. Lucas sat, feeling too large for the space, too rough for the delicate equilibrium she'd built here. Sarah remained standing, her arms crossed over her chest in a posture that was pure self-defense. "Your father was kind to me," she said, breaking the silence. "After John died. After I came back with nothing. He gave me loans I could never repay, access to water when my well ran dry, advice that kept me from losing everything. I know what you're thinking, that it doesn't make sense, that he was the one who—" She stopped, pressing her lips together. "But people change, Lucas. Even stubborn old men who think they know better than God." "I read his letter," Lucas said quietly. "The one he left for me. He explained why he did it, why he drove us apart." Sarah's expression shifted, softening slightly. "He was protecting you from the same pain he'd experienced. I understood that eventually. It didn't make it hurt less, but I understood." "I should have come back," Lucas said, the words tearing out of him. "I should have fought for you. I should have—" "You were 21, Sarah interrupted, her voice sharp. "Young and angry and absolutely certain that leaving was the only way to prove you were your own man. I don't blame you for that, Lucas. I blame you for not writing. Not once in 6 years did I hear from you. Not one letter, not one word. And then John asked me to marry him, and I said yes because I was tired of waiting for a ghost." The accusation hit like a blade between his ribs. She was right. He'd run and kept running, too proud to admit he'd made a mistake, too stubborn to reach out even when the loneliness had threatened to crush him. He told himself she was better off without him, that she'd moved on, that he'd done her a favor by leaving cleanly. But the truth was simpler and uglier. He'd been a coward. "I'm sorry," he said, and the words felt desperately inadequate. Sarah turned away, staring at the small window that looked out over her struggling piece of land. "John was a good man. He treated me well. I cared for him, even if I didn't—" She stopped, her shoulders rising and falling with a breath that sounded more like a sigh. "When he died, I thought I'd feel something more than relief, that I wouldn't have to pretend anymore. But mostly, I just felt empty." Lucas stood, moving closer but not touching, giving her space to finish what she needed to say. "Your father told me once that regret was the heaviest thing a person could carry," Sarah continued, her voice softer now. "He said he'd carried it for 30 years, and it had bent him into someone he didn't recognize. He asked me not to make the same mistake." She finally turned to face him, and her eyes were bright with unshed tears. "So I won't carry regret for us, Lucas. I won't regret loving you, even if it led nowhere. And I won't regret the life I built after you left, even if it wasn't the one I dreamed of." "What about now?" Lucas asked, his voice rough. "What do we do now?" Sarah wiped at her eyes with the back of her hand, a gesture so familiar it made his chest ache. "I don't know. You're here to settle an estate and leave, from what I hear. And I'm here because I have nowhere else to go. Those feel like pretty different paths, Lucas." He wanted to tell her that he'd stay, that he'd rebuild the ranch and make it something worthy of the second chance his father had tried to give him, that he'd spend every day for the rest of his life trying to prove he wasn't the boy who'd run away. But the words stuck in his throat because he didn't know if they were true. He didn't know if he could stay in this valley with its ghosts and its memories, and the weight of his father's expectations pressing down on him from beyond the grave. "I have a year," he said instead, "before I can sell or leave. The will requires me to stay and run the ranch for a year." Sarah's expression was unreadable. "A year's a long time, and it's not enough time at all." "No," Lucas agreed. "It's not." They stood there in her small cabin as night deepened outside and the fire crackled in the hearth. Two people who'd loved each other once and lost each other to pride and fear and all the ways that life could break even the strongest promises. And Lucas realized that coming home hadn't solved anything. It had only revealed the full scope of what he'd destroyed, and the impossible distance between where they were and where they might have been if he'd been brave enough to choose differently. But maybe, he thought as he looked at Sarah's face in the firelight, maybe a year was enough time to learn how to choose better, to build something honest instead of running from the ruins, to finally put down the weight of the past and see what could grow in its place. If she'd let him, if he could find the courage, if they both could learn to trust again in something neither of them believed in anymore. Love without fear. Partnership without pride. A future built on truth instead of the beautiful lies they'd once told themselves. It seemed impossible. But then again, so had coming home. Lucas left Sarah's cabin that night with more questions than answers, the weight of their conversation settling into his bones like cold rain. He rode back through the darkness with only starlight to guide him, his father's letter folded in his pocket and Sarah's words echoing in his head. A year was both too long and not enough time at all. The truth of it sat heavy in his chest as he stabled the horse and walked into the main house, where Hattie had left a lamp burning in the window like she'd done when he was a boy coming home late from the high pastures. Sleep didn't come easy. He lay in his old room, staring at the ceiling beams he'd memorized as a child, and wondered what kind of man his father had become in those final years. The man who'd driven him away had been made of iron and certainty, incapable of bending, unwilling to see past his own fear. But the man in that letter, the man who'd helped Sarah survive, who'd admitted his mistakes, who'd carried regret like stones in his pockets, that was someone Lucas didn't recognize at all. Morning came cold and clear, and Lucas was up before dawn, pulled by old habits and the restless energy of a man standing at a crossroads he couldn't quite see. He found Hattie already in the kitchen, making coffee strong enough to strip paint, and she handed him a cup without a word. They stood together in the gray light, and Lucas felt the years collapse between them. All the breakfasts they'd shared, all the silences that had said more than words ever could. "You saw her," Hattie said. It wasn't a question. "I saw her." "And?" Lucas took a long drink of coffee, letting the heat burn down his throat. "And nothing's fixed, nothing's simple. She's got every right to hate me, and she's too good to let herself do it." Sarah Caldwell never hated anybody in her life, Hattie said firmly. "It's not in her nature, but hurt? That's different. That she's carrying plenty of." "I know." Lucas set down his cup and moved to the window, watching as the sun crept over the eastern mountains, painting the valley in shades of rose and gold. "My father's will. The obligations he left. Tell me what else I need to know." Hattie settled into a chair with her own coffee, her expression thoughtful. "Your father made promises. To the widow Henshaw, whose husband died in a mining accident, he's been paying to keep her feed store running. To the Ramirez family, whose eldest son came back from the war missing a leg, he gave them grazing rights on the northern section. To the church, for repairs and the school teacher's salary. And to Sarah." She paused, measuring her words. "He forgave her debts 2 months before he died. Every penny she owed him he wiped clean, left a note saying it was payment for damages done." Lucas felt something twist in his chest. His father had been trying to make amends, scattered pieces of restitution that would never add up to absolution but were offered anyway, desperately, in the face of death. "What damages?" "The ones he caused," Hattie said quietly. "By keeping you apart, by letting pride matter more than people. He knew what he'd cost both of you, and he was trying to balance scales that can't be balanced." Lucas turned back to face her. "I need to see the books. All of them. I need to know exactly what I'm dealing with." They spent the morning in his father's study, a room that still smelled of tobacco and leather, surrounded by ledgers that documented decades of careful stewardship and the recent years of surprising generosity. Lucas traced the entries with his finger, seeing his father's handwriting grow shakier as illness took hold, watching as money flowed out to support people who'd once been nothing more than names on a property map. The ranch was still profitable, barely, but the margins were thin and the obligations were many. He was trying to buy forgiveness, Lucas said, leaning back in his father's chair and feeling like an imposter. From the whole valley, from God, from me. "Maybe," Hattie allowed. "Or maybe he just figured out what mattered before it was too late to do anything about it." Tom Winters arrived around noon, riding up with 2 other ranch hands Lucas didn't recognize. They gathered in the yard and Tom made introductions. Miguel Santos, a Mexican vaquero with 30 years of experience and hands scarred from hard work, and Danny Coulter, a kid barely 20 with eager eyes and the kind of reckless energy that reminded Lucas uncomfortably of himself at that age. "These are the bones of your crew," Tom said, gesturing to the men. "We've got 3 more hands who work the line camps and rotate through. Your father kept it lean after the war, couldn't get reliable men, and couldn't afford to pay what he used to." Lucas nodded, assessing each man with the practiced eye of someone who'd worked a dozen different outfits. Miguel met his gaze steadily, the kind of man who'd seen enough not to be impressed by a title or a name. Danny practically vibrated with eagerness to prove himself. Tom remained cautious, waiting to see what kind of boss Lucas would be. "I'll be straight with you," Lucas said. "I'm here because the will says I have to be. I don't know if I'm staying past the year, but while I'm here, I'll run this place right. You'll get your wages on time, you'll get treated fair, and you'll work harder than you've probably been working because we're going to turn a profit instead of just surviving." Miguel's mouth quirked slightly. "Your father said something similar once. Then he got soft." "I'm not my father," Lucas said flatly. "Soft isn't a problem I have." They spent the afternoon writing the property lines, Tom pointing out what had changed and what hadn't, where the herd was grazing and where the spring calving would happen. The ranch was bigger than Lucas remembered, sprawling across valleys and foothills, crossing 3 separate creeks and touching the timberline on the western slope. It was beautiful in a way that hurt to look at. Endless sky and rolling grassland and mountains that stood like sentinels at the edge of the world. This was what his father had protected. This was what Lucas had walked away from. "The eastern section is where things get complicated," Tom said as they rode toward the ridge that separated Merrick land from Sarah's property. "Your father gave grazing rights to Mrs. Caldwell. Let her run her cattle with ours during the winter when the high pastures are under snow. Some of the other landholders didn't like it, thought he was being too generous with resources that should have stayed in the family." Lucas could imagine the gossip, the way small towns fed on scandal and speculation. "Let me guess. They think I'll cut her off now that my father's gone." "They're waiting to see what kind of man you are," Tom said diplomatically. "Whether you're like him at the end or like him at the beginning." They crested the ridge and Lucas could see Sarah's land spread out below, the small cabin, the struggling herd, the garden plot that looked painfully vulnerable against the vastness of the landscape. She was there, working in the corral, and even from this distance Lucas could see the set of her shoulders, the determined way she moved. She'd always been strong. He'd just been too young and stupid to understand what that strength would cost her. "I'm not cutting her off," Lucas said, his voice harder than he intended. "My father made promises. I'll keep them." Tom studied him for a long moment. "That's good. That's right. But Lucas, keeping promises and making things right aren't always the same thing. You know that, don't you?" Lucas didn't answer. He turned his horse and headed back toward the ranch house, leaving the question hanging in the air like smoke. That evening, Brennan arrived with more documents, more legal complexities that required Lucas's signature and attention. They sat in the study while the lawyer explained water rights and mineral claims and the intricate web of agreements that held the valley together. Lucas signed where he was told to sign, his hand cramping from the repetition, his mind only half focused on the words in front of him. "There's one more matter," Brennan said, adjusting his spectacles in that nervous way of his. "Your father established a trust. It's not large, but it's designated specifically for improvements to the Caldwell property. Repairs to the cabin, a new well, fencing materials. He wanted to ensure that if anything happened to him, she'd still have the resources to succeed." Lucas set down the pen and rubbed his eyes, exhaustion pulling at him. He really did try to fix everything, didn't he? "In his way," Brennan agreed, "though I suspect he knew it wasn't enough. Some mistakes can't be unmade, Mr. Merrick. They can only be accommodated." After the lawyer left, Lucas sat alone in his father's study, surrounded by the evidence of a life lived and regretted. He pulled out the letter again and read it by lamplight, searching for answers that weren't written in the words themselves. His father had understood too late that land meant nothing without people to share it with. That legacy was just another word for loneliness if it was built on the ruins of love. But understanding hadn't changed the past. It had only made the present more complicated. Lucas heard footsteps in the hall and looked up to find Hattie standing in the doorway, a shawl wrapped around her shoulders against the evening chill. "You planning to sleep in that chair?" she asked. "Might as well. Not like I'm sleeping anyway." She came into the room and settled into the chair opposite his desk, the same chair she'd sat in countless times when his mother was alive and this house had felt less like a mausoleum. "Your father used to sit there after your mother died, drinking whiskey and staring at nothing. I'd come in here and find him with tears on his face, though he'd never admit to crying." Grief doesn't make a man less of a tyrant, Lucas said bitterly. No, Hattie agreed. But it can make a tyrant into something more human. That's what happened to your father after you left. The grief of losing you, on top of losing your mother, it broke something open in him, made him see what he'd been doing, what he'd become. Lucas wanted to feel sympathy, wanted to forgive the old man and move forward with some kind of peace. But the anger was still there, hot and immediate, fed by 6 years of absence and the sight of Sarah struggling alone on land that should have been part of something bigger. He had years to write to me, to tell me he'd changed, to ask me to come home. Pride works both ways, Hattie said gently. He was afraid you'd refuse, afraid the damage was permanent, and maybe he was right to be afraid. Would you have come back if he'd asked? The question hung between them, unanswerable. Lucas wanted to say yes, wanted to believe he was better than his father's stubbornness, but the truth was he'd built his own walls, his own defenses, and they were just as high as the ones Josiah Merrick had constructed. They were more alike than Lucas wanted to admit, father and son, both of them too proud to bend until it was too late. I need to talk to her again, Lucas said finally. Sarah, I need to tell her about the trust, about my father's plans. Be careful, Hattie warned. She's built a life on her own terms. Don't come in thinking you're rescuing her. She doesn't need rescuing. Lucas thought about that as he rode out the next morning, taking the trail along the creek that led to Sarah's property. The day was warming, spring pushing back against the last of winter's chill, and the valley was coming alive with new grass and wildflowers. He found Sarah in her garden, on her knees in the dirt, planting something he couldn't identify from the road. She looked up as he dismounted, her expression guarded but not hostile. Lucas? Morning. He tied his horse and walked to the edge of the garden, careful not to step on her work. I need to talk to you about something, about my father's will. Sarah sat back on her heels, wiping her hands on her apron. If this is about the debts he forgave, I already know. Mr. Brennan told me before your father died. I tried to refuse, but your father said it wasn't up for negotiation. It's not just the debts, Lucas said. He set up a trust for improvements to your land, money for repairs, for expansion, whatever you need to make this place viable. Sarah's expression shifted through surprise to something harder, more complicated. Why would he do that? Because he felt guilty. Because he was trying to fix what he broke. Lucas crouched down so they were at eye level, the garden between them like neutral ground. He wrote in his letter that he couldn't undo what he'd done to us, but he could at least make sure you had a chance. I don't want his guilt money, Sarah said, her voice tight. I've made it this far on my own. I can keep going. Can you? Lucas asked bluntly. I rode your property line yesterday. You're barely holding on, Sarah. Your herd is too small, your grazing land is poor, and you're doing work that should take 3 men. How long do you think you can sustain this? Her eyes flashed with anger. As long as I have to. I didn't come back here to be rescued, Lucas. Not by your father, and certainly not by you. I'm not trying to rescue you, Lucas said, though Hattie's warning echoed in his head. I'm trying to honor my father's last wishes. The trust exists whether you use it or not. The question is whether you're going to let pride get in the way of practical sense. Sarah stood abruptly, brushing dirt from her dress. Don't talk to me about pride. You wrote the book on it. You let pride drive you away from here, and you've been living with the consequences ever since. You're right, Lucas said, rising to face her. I did. And I've spent 6 years regretting it. But this isn't about me or what I did wrong. This is about you having the resources to build something sustainable, to stop just surviving and start actually living. They stood there in the morning sunlight, the argument hanging between them like a challenge. Sarah's jaw was set, her eyes bright with frustration, and Lucas could see the war happening behind her expression, the desire for independence battling against the exhausting reality of her situation. What would your father want me to do with the money? She asked finally, her voice softer. He left it open-ended, but if I had to guess, he'd want you to dig a proper well, expand your herd, build a decent barn so you're not losing livestock to weather. Make this place into something that can support you for the long term. Sarah looked away, staring out at her land with an expression Lucas couldn't quite read. He talked to me about that once, about 6 months before he died. He said I reminded him of your mother, stubborn and strong and unwilling to ask for help even when drowning. He said that's what killed her in the end. The isolation, the pride. Lucas felt something cold settle in his stomach. My mother died of fever. Your mother died of loneliness, Sarah corrected gently. Everyone knew it, even if the doctor called it something else. She withered here, Lucas, cut off from her family, judged by the town, with only your father for company, and he was... She stopped herself, seeming to realize she was crossing into territory too painful to navigate. He was what? Lucas pressed. He was broken by what he'd done to her, Sarah said quietly. He loved her desperately, but he could never give her back what she'd lost when she chose him. And that guilt ate him alive. It's why he reacted the way he did when you wanted to marry me. He was terrified of watching history repeat itself. Lucas sat down hard on the edge of the garden fence, the revelation hitting him like a physical blow. He'd known his mother had been unhappy. Anyone could see it in the sad smile she wore like a mask, in the way she stared out windows as if searching for a life she'd left behind. But he'd always blamed his father's coldness, his inability to show affection, his obsession with the ranch above all else. He'd never understood it was guilt that had turned Josiah Merrick to stone. He never told me any of this, Lucas said. He couldn't, Sarah replied. How do you tell your son that your love destroyed the woman you married? That every day you watched her fade and knew it was your fault? Lucas looked up at her, this woman who'd somehow become the keeper of his family's secrets, who'd seen his father with clearer eyes than Lucas ever had. How do you know all this? Because he talked to me, Sarah said simply. In those last months when he knew he was dying, he needed someone to confess to. And I was safe. Someone he'd wronged. Someone who had no reason to forgive him but might understand anyway. We'd sit in his study and he'd tell me things. About your mother. About you. About all the ways pride had poisoned his life. What did he say about me? Sarah moved to sit beside him on the fence, close enough that Lucas could smell the dirt on her hands and the lavender soap she still used. He said you were the best thing he'd ever made, and the thing he'd ruined most completely. He said if he could go back, he'd get on his knees and beg you to stay, to marry me, to choose love over land. But he couldn't go back, so he tried to go forward differently. They sat in silence for a while, the morning birds singing in the trees and the creek burbling in the distance. Lucas felt the pieces of his understanding shift and reform, creating a picture that was more complicated and more painful than the simple narrative of tyranny he'd carried for 6 years. I'll use the trust money, Sarah said eventually, but I want to do it right. I want to hire proper help, buy quality stock, build things that'll last. I'm not going to waste your father's last attempt at redemption on half measures. Our fathers, Lucas corrected quietly. Whatever else he was still that. Sarah looked at him, her green eyes searching his face for something Lucas wasn't sure he could give. Are you going to stay, Lucas? Really stay? Past the year the will requires? I don't know, he admitted. A week ago, I would have said no without thinking, but now... He gestured helplessly at the valley spread out before them, at the land that held generations of Merrick history and heartbreak. I don't know what I'm supposed to do anymore. Every answer feels wrong. Maybe there isn't a right answer, Sarah suggested. Maybe there's just what you can live with and what you can't. Over the next few weeks, Lucas threw himself into the work of running the ranch with a focus that bordered on obsession. He and the hands pushed the cattle to better grazing, repaired fence lines that had sagged over the winter, cleared irrigation ditches, and reinforced the dam that fed water to the lower pastures. The work was brutal and familiar, the kind of labor that required every ounce of strength and left no room for thinking about anything beyond the immediate task. Lucas welcomed it. But even as he worked, he found himself watching the eastern ridge, checking to see if smoke rose from Sarah's chimney, noting when she rode into town for supplies and when she was working her own land. He told himself he was just being practical, keeping track of the properties that bordered his own. But Hattie's knowing looks and Tom's carefully neutral comments told him everyone knew better. Sarah came to the ranch 3 weeks after their conversation about the trust, riding up in the late afternoon with a list of supplies she needed and a proposal that made Lucas's eyebrows raise. I want to combine the spring branding, she said without preamble, standing in the yard with her hat in her hands and the sun backlighting her hair. My herd and yours. It'll be more efficient, and your hands know what they're doing. I'll pay in labor. I can cook for the crew, handle the tallying, whatever you need. Lucas studied her, trying to read the calculation behind the offer. You don't need to pay in labor. The trust covers hiring help. I know, Sarah said, but I want to learn how a real operation works, and I want your men to see that I'm serious about making my land productive, not just existing on charity. Tom, who'd been listening from the barn door, nodded approvingly. Makes sense. We could use another pair of hands with the cooking, and Mrs. Caldwell knows her way around cattle. So it was settled. The spring branding became a joint operation, Sarah's dozen head mixing with the Merrick herd in a way that felt both practical and symbolic. She moved through the work with competent efficiency, her hands steady as she wielded the branding iron, her voice calm as she helped manage the cutting and sorting. The men respected her. Lucas could see it in the way they took her suggestions seriously, in how Danny jumped to help her lift heavy equipment without being asked. Lucas found himself working alongside her, their movements falling into the kind of rhythm that came from shared purpose. They didn't talk much. The work was too loud and demanding for conversation, but there was something in the silence that felt less hostile than it had before. A tentative peace, fragile but real. On the third day of branding, a rider came up from town with news that sent ripples of concern through the crew. The railroad was expanding again, surveyors mapping a new line that would cut through the northern section of the valley. If it went through, it would mean dividing properties, negotiating easements, and fundamentally changing the landscape that had remained largely untouched for 30 years. They'll want to cross Merrick land, Tom said grimly as they gathered in the yard to discuss the news. And probably some of the smaller holdings too. Your father fought them off last time, but now that he's gone, they think they can push through, Lucas finished. He looked at Sarah, who'd gone very pale. Your land in the path? I don't know, she said. I'd need to see the survey maps, but if it is… She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. They all knew what the railroad could do to a small operation like hers. The noise would scatter cattle, the construction would disrupt water sources, and the settlement that followed would bring strangers and change that could destroy the delicate balance she'd been trying to maintain. We need to organize, Lucas said, making the decision before he'd fully thought it through. All the landholders in the northern section present a unified front. The railroad has power, but they don't have infinite power. If we stand together, we can negotiate better terms. Miguel spoke up from where he'd been listening. Your father tried that. The valley's not good at standing together. Too many old feuds, too much history. Then we'll have to give them a reason to put history aside, Lucas said. He turned to Sarah, starting with us. If people see that a Merrick and a Caldwell can work together, it might convince others to do the same. Sarah met his eyes, and Lucas saw understanding dawn in her expression. This was bigger than their personal history. This was about protecting the valley itself, the land that had shaped both their families and would outlast their individual grievances. I'm in, she said. Whatever it takes. That evening, Lucas and Sarah rode together to visit the other landholders, starting with the Ramirez family, whose eldest son, Pedro, had lost his leg at Shiloh and now worked the land with grit and determination. Maria Ramirez welcomed them into her kitchen with the kind of warmth that transcended language barriers and old suspicions, and they sat around a rough-hewn table explaining the situation while Maria's younger children peeked around doorways. The railroad will offer money, Pedro said in careful English, his cane leaning against his chair. Good money. Enough that people will be tempted. Short-term gain, Lucas countered, but long-term loss. Once they cut through the valley, everything changes. The quiet's gone, the isolation's gone. The way of life our family's built, it's finished. Maybe it's time for it to be finished, Maria said gently. Maybe the old ways need to die so new ones can grow. It was Sarah who answered, leaning forward with an intensity that made even Lucas pay attention. Change is coming whether we want it or not. But we get to decide what kind of change. Do we let the railroad dictate terms, or do we negotiate from a position of strength? Do we sell our legacy piece by piece, or do we protect it while accepting that some things have to evolve? The conversation went long into the night, and by the time Lucas and Sarah rode back toward their respective properties, they'd secured the Ramirez family's agreement to attend a larger meeting of landholders. It was a start. They paused at the fork in the trail where their paths diverged, neither quite ready to separate despite the lateness of the hour. "You were good back there," Lucas said. "Maria was ready to dismiss the whole thing until you spoke up." "She knows what it's like to fight for something everyone says is already lost," Sarah replied. "Her son, her family's place here. She understands that giving up isn't always the practical choice. Sometimes it's just giving up." Lucas studied her in the moonlight, this woman who'd become someone he barely recognized and yet knew better than anyone. "We make a good team." "For this maybe," Sarah allowed. "But don't mistake necessity for something it's not, Lucas." "What do you think it is?" She looked at him for a long moment, her expression unreadable in the shadows. "I think it's two people trying to save something bigger than themselves. That doesn't mean we've saved anything between us." She rode away before Lucas could respond, leaving him alone at the crossroads with the truth of her words settling into his bones. She was right. Working together didn't undo the past, didn't heal the wounds that had been festering for 6 years. But it was something. And something was more than he'd had a month ago when he'd stepped off that train expecting nothing but paperwork and escape. The meeting of landholders happened 2 weeks later in the church hall, every pew packed with families who'd worked this valley for generations and newcomers who'd arrived with the railroad and stayed for the opportunity. Lucas stood at the front beside Sarah, and together they presented their case: the need for unified negotiation, the danger of accepting the railroad's first offer, the importance of protecting water rights and grazing access even as they acknowledged that progress was inevitable. There was resistance. Old grudges surfaced like rocks in a plowed field. The Hendersons, who'd feuded with the Merricks over water rights a decade ago, argued that Lucas had no standing to lead anyone after abandoning the valley for 6 years. The Mitchells questioned Sarah's involvement, suggesting that a woman with barely any land had no business advising others on protecting their interests. But there were also moments of unexpected unity. Widow Henshaw stood and spoke about Josiah Merrick's quiet generosity in his final years, how he'd kept her store running when banks wouldn't loan to a woman alone. The Reverend reminded everyone that the church's new roof had been paid for by Merrick money, and that whatever the old man's faults, he'd tried to make amends before death claimed him. By the end of the night, they'd formed a coalition, 12 families representing most of the Northern Valley, agreeing to negotiate collectively with the railroad. Lucas was chosen to lead the discussions, with Sarah handling the documentation and Pedro Ramirez serving as the voice of the smaller landholders. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't even entirely friendly, but it was progress of a kind that his father would have never believed possible. As people filed out of the church, Sarah touched Lucas's arm. "Your father would be proud." "My father would be shocked," Lucas corrected. "He never trusted anyone enough to build something like this." "Then maybe you're not as much like him as you think." Lucas wanted to believe that, wanted to believe he was capable of being the kind of man who could build bridges instead of burning them. But the doubt lingered, fed by 6 years of running and the knowledge that staying was harder than leaving had ever been. That night, alone in his father's study with ledgers spread before him and the weight of responsibility pressing down like a physical thing, Lucas finally understood what his father had been trying to tell him in that letter. The land meant nothing without people to share it with. Legacy was just another word for loneliness if it was built on the ruins of love and trust. And the choice between running and staying wasn't really a choice at all. It was a reckoning with the kind of man you wanted to be when the dust settled, and you had to look at yourself in the mirror. Lucas didn't have all the answers yet, didn't know if he could stay past the year, didn't know if Sarah would ever trust him enough to let him truly close again. But for the first time since he'd stepped off that train, he felt like maybe, just maybe, he was building towards something instead of running from it. And that small shift, that tentative movement toward hope instead of away from pain, felt like the beginning of something he couldn't quite name but desperately wanted to believe in. The railroad negotiations stretched through early summer like a slow-burning fuse, each meeting more tense than the last. Lucas found himself sitting across oak tables from men in Eastern suits who spoke in percentages and easements, while the landholders he represented grew increasingly restless with the pace of progress. The railroad wanted a corridor through the heart of the Northern Valley, straight through grazing land that had sustained families for generations, and their initial offer was insultingly low, barely enough to compensate for a single season's loss, let alone the permanent disruption of established patterns. Sarah attended every meeting, her presence a steady anchor that kept Lucas grounded when frustration threatened to override strategy. She took meticulous notes, asked questions the suited men didn't expect from a woman, and more than once caught discrepancies in the contracts that would have cost the landholders dearly. The railroad representatives learned quickly not to underestimate her, though their resentment showed in tight smiles and condescending explanations she dismantled with polite precision. It was after one particularly brutal session, where the railroad had threatened to invoke eminent domain if the landholders didn't accept their terms, that Lucas and Sarah found themselves alone in the church hall with evening shadows lengthening across the wooden floor. Sarah was gathering her papers with hands that trembled slightly, her composure finally cracking after hours of maintaining professional calm. "They're going to force it through," she said, her voice tight. "All this negotiating, all this organizing, it won't matter if they decide to just take what they want." Lucas leaned against the wall, exhaustion pulling at every muscle. "They can try. But eminent domain isn't as simple as they're making it sound. They need to prove public necessity, and a shortcut through private grazing land when there are alternative routes doesn't meet that standard. They're bluffing." "Are they?" Sarah looked up, her eyes reflecting a fear Lucas understood too well. "Or are we the ones bluffing, pretending we have power we don't actually possess?" "We have more power than they want us to believe," Lucas said, pushing off the wall and moving closer. "We have unity. We have documentation of every inch of land they want to cross. We have the truth that their proposed route disrupts water access for a dozen families. And we have something they're terrified of. We're willing to fight this publicly, in newspapers and courts, and make them look like the bullies they are." Sarah set down her papers and rubbed her temples, a gesture of weariness that made Lucas want to take the burden from her shoulders and carry it himself. "I'm tired, Lucas. Tired of fighting. Tired of having to prove I deserve to exist on land that should have been—" She stopped herself, but they both knew how the sentence ended. Land that should have been theirs together, part of a life they'd planned before pride and fear had torn it apart. "I know," Lucas said quietly. He wanted to reach for her, to close the distance between them that was both physical and something much harder to bridge, but he held back, respecting the boundaries she'd drawn even as he ached to cross them. "But you're not fighting alone anymore. That has to count for something." She met his eyes then, and Lucas saw the war happening behind her expression, the desire to trust warring with the memory of abandonment, hope colliding with the harsh lessons learned from loss. "Does it? You're here because a will forced you to be. Once that year is up, what's stopping you from leaving again?" The question hung between them like an accusation and a plea, and Lucas felt the weight of it settle into his chest alongside all the other impossible choices he'd been avoiding. "I don't know," he admitted, and the honesty of it felt like stripping himself bare. "I came here planning to leave. Every instinct I have says to run before I get trapped in the same patterns that destroyed my father. But every day I stay, it gets harder to imagine leaving, and that terrifies me, Sarah, because what if I stay and it still goes wrong? What if I become him, bitter and controlling and so afraid of loss that I strangle everything I touch?" Sarah moved closer, close enough that Lucas could see the fine lines that had appeared at the corners of her eyes, the evidence of years spent squinting into sun and wind and hardship. "You're not your father," she said, her voice softer than he'd heard it in weeks. "You're afraid of becoming him, which means you're already different." He never questioned himself, never doubted his choices. That certainty was his curse. "And doubt is mine," Lucas said. "Maybe," Sarah allowed. "Or maybe doubt is what keeps you human, what keeps you from making the same mistakes." They stood in the dimming light of the church hall, the space between them charged with everything they weren't saying, and Lucas felt the careful control he'd been maintaining start to crack. 6 years of absence, 6 weeks of careful professionalism, and suddenly it was all too much, the proximity, the shared purpose, the way she looked at him like she was seeing past every defense he'd constructed. "I never stopped thinking about you," Lucas said, the words escaping before he could cage them. Every town I drifted through, every woman I tried to. He stopped, shaking his head. You were the measure I used for everything, and nothing ever came close. And I hated you for that. Hated that you'd marked me so deeply that 6 years and 1,000 miles couldn't erase it. Sarah's breath caught, her eyes going wide with something that might have been pain or recognition or both. You hated me? I hated that I still loved you, Lucas corrected. That I'd thrown away the best thing in my life and couldn't stop wanting it back. That I was too proud and too scared to come home and find out if there was anything left to salvage. There wasn't, Sarah said, and the words were like knives, even though Lucas had known they were coming. By the time I would have taken you back, I was married to someone else. By the time I was free again, I'd learned to survive without needing anyone. You can't salvage something that's already been buried, Lucas. Then what are we doing? Lucas asked, his voice rough. This partnership, this working together, what is it if not an attempt to salvage something? It's building something new, Sarah said. Something that doesn't depend on who we used to be or what we used to want. Maybe that's better. Maybe the thing we lost needed to die so something stronger could grow in its place. Before Lucas could respond, the church door swung open and Tom Winters stepped inside, his expression grave. We've got trouble. Riders just came up from the southern section, Mitchell's place. The railroad surveyors were on his land this afternoon, marking trees without permission. Ben Mitchell ran them off with a shotgun. Lucas swore under his breath. This was exactly the kind of escalation they'd been trying to avoid, the spark that could turn negotiation into open conflict. Anyone hurt? No, but the surveyors are back in town making noise about assault and threatening to bring in federal marshals. This could get ugly fast. Sarah grabbed her papers and hat. We need to get to Mitchell before the railroad does. If they arrest him, it'll splinter the coalition. Everyone will panic and start accepting whatever terms they can get individually. They rode through the darkness toward the Mitchell homestead, Lucas pushing his horse harder than was wise on uncertain terrain. Ben Mitchell was exactly the kind of man who'd shoot first and consider consequences later, a former Union soldier with a hair-trigger temper and a deep distrust of authority in any form. He'd been one of the hardest to convince to join the coalition, and now he was threatening to destroy it through sheer belligerence. They found Mitchell on his porch, shotgun across his knees, surrounded by his wife and 3 sons who ranged from 12 to 18. The eldest boy had a rifle, and the way he held it suggested he knew how to use it. The scene was a powder keg waiting for a match. Ben, Lucas said carefully, dismounting slowly with his hands visible. We need to talk. Nothing to talk about, Mitchell said flatly. They were on my land without permission. I had every right to defend my property. You had the right, Lucas agreed, but pointing a gun at railroad surveyors gives them exactly the excuse they need to bring in federal authority. Once marshals are involved, all our negotiating power evaporates. So what was I supposed to do? Let them mark up my trees, plan their route through my grazing land like I don't exist? Sarah stepped forward, her voice calm but firm. You were supposed to document it, take photographs, get witnesses, build a legal case instead of giving them ammunition to paint us all as violent frontier thugs who can't be reasoned with. Mitchell's wife, Catherine, touched her husband's arm. She's right, Ben. You know she's right. We can't fight the railroad with guns. They have more guns, more men, more everything. We have to be smarter than them. The tension held for a long moment, Mitchell's jaw working as pride battled with pragmatism. Finally, he lowered the shotgun. Fine, but if they come back on my land, I'm documenting it with buckshot. Document it with me, Lucas said. Next time they show up anywhere without permission, you send word immediately. I'll ride out with witnesses, we'll make a record, and we'll use it in court. That's how we win this, Ben. Not with violence, but with proof of their overreach. They spent an hour talking Mitchell down from his anger and helping Catherine convince the boys to put away their weapons. By the time Lucas and Sarah rode back toward town, dawn was starting to paint the eastern sky in shades of rose and gold, and exhaustion had settled into the Lucas's bones like lead weight. That could have gone badly, Sarah said, her voice hoarse from tiredness. It still might, Lucas replied. If the railroad pushes charges, if federal authority gets involved, this whole thing could collapse. Then we need to move faster. Force the railroad to negotiate seriously before they can build momentum for legal action. Sarah pulled her horse alongside his. And we need to show unity. Public unity, something that makes it clear we're not a scattered group of individuals they can pick off one by one. Lucas knew what she was suggesting before she said it. A gathering, all the families. Make it visible that we're organized. More than that, Sarah said. Make it celebratory. A summer festival, like the Valley used to have before the war. Show that we're not just fighting against something, we're fighting for a way of life worth preserving. It was brilliant and dangerous in equal measure. A public gathering would draw attention, force the railroad to acknowledge that they were dealing with a community rather than isolated landholders. But it would also expose divisions, test the fragile unity they'd been building, and potentially provide ammunition for their opponents if anything went wrong. Your father used to talk about the old festivals, Sarah continued, before everything got so fractured. He said they were the backbone of the valley, the thing that reminded everyone they were part of something bigger than their individual struggles. Lucas thought about his father, about the man who'd been so isolated by his own choices that he'd forgotten how to be part of a community until it was too late to matter. Maybe that was the real lesson in that letter. Not just about love and land, but about the danger of standing alone when standing together was possible. We'll do it, Lucas decided. Last weekend of July. On Merrick land, so there's no question about permission or access. Music, food, games for the kids. And in the middle of it all, a public signing of our coalition agreement. Make it impossible for the railroad to pretend we're not serious. They parted ways at the fork in the trail, and Lucas rode back to the ranch with his mind already planning logistics. Hattie was up when he arrived, making coffee in the pre-dawn dimness, and she took one look at his face and poured him a cup without comment. "You look like hell," she observed. "Feel like it, too." Lucas collapsed into a chair and wrapped his hands around the warmth of the cup. "We're going to host a Valley Festival, last weekend of July. I need you to start spreading word and organizing the women for food and setup." Hattie's eyebrows rose. "A festival? Your father would have had apoplexy." "My father's dead," Lucas said, more harshly than he intended. "And I'm not him. I'm trying to do something different, Hattie. Trying to build instead of just defending. So will you help me or not?" She studied him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "I'll help. And Lucas, you're right. You're not your father. That's the best thing you could possibly be." The next weeks were a blur of activity that left no time for doubt or second-guessing. Word spread through the valley with surprising speed, carried by women visiting neighbors and men meeting at the feed store, and the response was larger than Lucas had dared hope. Families who'd been sitting on the fence about joining the coalition suddenly found reasons to participate. Even some who'd taken the railroad's money started showing interest, perhaps sensing that the tide was turning in ways they hadn't anticipated. Sarah threw herself into the organizing with fierce efficiency, coordinating with Catherine Mitchell and Maria Ramirez and a dozen other women who understood that this festival was about more than celebration. It was about survival. They planned food and music, games for children and shooting competitions for the men, quilt displays and pie contests, and all the trappings of community that had been absent from the valley for too long. Lucas found himself working alongside Sarah more often than not, their conversations shifting from purely practical to something more personal as the pressure of constant work broke down the careful walls they'd maintained. They talked about small things, memories of the valley before the war, stories about people they'd both known, dreams they'd had as children that seemed impossibly naive from the perspective of adulthood. One evening, as they sat on the porch of the main house going over final preparations, Sarah asked the question Lucas had been both expecting and dreading. "What happens after the year is up, Lucas? After you've fulfilled the will's requirements?" Lucas stared out at the valley, at the land that had been both inheritance and burden, watching as the last light faded from the western sky. "I don't know anymore. When I came here, the answer was simple. Settle the estate and leave. But now," he gestured at the papers between them, at the evidence of everything they'd built. "How do I walk away from this? From the coalition, from the people depending on me, from me?" Sarah finished softly when he couldn't. "From you," Lucas agreed. "From whatever this is that we're building. It's not what we had before. It's something different, something I don't have words for, but it feels important in ways that terrify me." Sarah was quiet for a long moment, her fingers tracing patterns on the arm of her chair. "I told myself I wouldn't do this again. Wouldn't open myself up to someone who might leave. John was safe because I never really loved him. Not the way I loved you. Losing him hurt, but it didn't destroy me. You, though, she looked at him, and Lucas saw fear in her eyes that mirrored his own. You could destroy me, Lucas, and I'm not sure I'm brave enough to risk that again. What if I promised to stay? Lucas asked. What if I told you right now that I'm not leaving, that I'll be here for as long as you want me? Then I'd say you're making a promise you can't be sure you'll keep, Sarah said, because you don't know yet who you are or what you want. You're still figuring out if you're the man who runs or the man who stays, and until you know that with certainty, any promise you make is just words. The truth of it hit Lucas like cold water. She was right. He was still hovering between identities, still testing the weight of staying against the freedom of leaving, still not entirely sure which choice would define him. And Sarah, who'd been left before, who'd built a life from the ruins of abandonment, deserved better than uncertain promises. Then I'll show you instead of telling you, Lucas said. Through this festival, through the railroad negotiations, through whatever comes next, I'll show you the kind of man I'm choosing to be, and you can decide if that's someone worth trusting. Sarah nodded slowly. That's fair? That's more fair than I probably deserve, given how scared I am of letting you close again. You deserve everything, Lucas said fiercely. You deserve certainty and security, and someone who won't flinch when things get hard. I don't know if I can be that person, Sarah, but I want to try. For the first time in 6 years, I want to try instead of just running. They sat together as night settled over the valley, the space between them still charged with caution and longing. And Lucas felt something shift in his chest, a small opening where there had been only walls, a tentative movement toward hope that felt like the beginning of healing, even as it terrified him with its fragility. The day of the festival arrived with perfect summer weather, the sky cloudless and blue, the heat tempered by a breeze that carried the scent of pine and wildflowers. Families started arriving at mid-morning, wagons loaded with food and children, the Merrick Ranch transforming into something Lucas barely recognized, alive with color and sound and the kind of joy that felt almost foreign after years of conflict and isolation. Lucas moved through the crowd, shaking hands and accepting congratulations on an event that felt bigger than anything he'd intended. Musicians had set up near the barn, fiddles and guitars creating melodies that pulled people onto makeshift dance floors. Long tables groaned under the weight of food that represented every family's contribution: roasted meats and fresh bread, pies and cakes, vegetables from gardens that had been coaxed into abundance through hard work and hope. He found Sarah near the quilting display, surrounded by women admiring the intricate patterns that represented hundreds of hours of labor. She'd changed from her usual practical work clothes into a dress the color of sage, her hair loose around her shoulders in a way that made Lucas's breath catch. She looked up and caught him staring, and something passed between them, recognition of a moment balanced on the edge of possibility. Mr. Merrick. The voice came from behind him, cold and official. Lucas turned to find 3 men in suits, clearly not locals, clearly not here for the celebration. The one who'd spoken was tall and thin with the kind of face that had never smiled genuinely. I'm James Hartwick, Chief Counsel for the Western Pacific Railroad. We need to talk. Lucas felt the mood shift around him as people noticed the intruders, conversations dying away as attention focused on this unexpected confrontation. This is a private gathering, Mr. Hartwick. If you want to talk, we can schedule a proper meeting. We're done with meetings, Hartwick said. We're here to inform you that the railroad will be moving forward with the northern route regardless of your coalition's objections. We've secured the necessary federal approvals and surveying will begin immediately. Any interference will be met with legal action and, if necessary, force. The words fell like stones into water, ripples of shock and anger spreading through the gathered families. Lucas saw Ben Mitchell's hand move toward his hip before Catherine grabbed his arm. Saw Pedro Ramirez's face go hard with the kind of fury that came from watching dreams die. Saw Sarah's expression shift from hope to devastation in the space of a heartbeat. You can't do that, Lucas said, his voice deadly calm even as rage built behind his ribs. We have documented violations of your surveying protocols, proof that you've exceeded your legal authority, and witnesses who will testify that your initial route assessment was deliberately misleading. We have federal approval, Hartwick repeated, which supersedes any local objections. You can fight it in court if you like, but by the time any case is heard, the route will be completed and your argument will be moot. Sarah stepped forward, and Lucas saw something in her face that made him think of steel wrapped in silk, something that looked soft but could cut through bone. Then you're making a mistake, Mr. Hartwick, because this gathering isn't just a social event, it's documentation. Every person here is a witness to your illegal tactics, your refusal to negotiate in good faith, your threats of force against law-abiding citizens, and every one of them will testify when we take this to the newspapers, to the territorial governor, to anyone who'll listen that the Western Pacific Railroad tried to steal land through intimidation when legal channels didn't give them what they wanted fast enough. Hartwick's expression flickered, just slightly, just enough to show that Sarah's words had found their mark. You think public opinion matters to the railroad? I think federal approval can be revoked when it's based on misrepresented facts, Sarah said. I think senators care about voter perception when those voters are organized and angry. And I think you've just made a serious miscalculation by coming here today and threatening an entire community in front of witnesses. The silence that followed was absolute. Every eye on the confrontation, every person understanding that this was the moment that would define whether their unity meant anything at all. Lucas felt his heart hammering against his ribs, felt the weight of expectation pressing down on him, felt the terrible vertigo of standing on the edge of either triumph or catastrophic failure. Then Tom Winters stepped forward from the crowd. I'm with the Merricks. Whatever fight this is, I'm in it. So am I, Maria Ramirez said, her voice carrying across the yard. The railroad doesn't get to destroy our homes without consequences. One by one, families stepped forward, voices joining in a chorus of defiance that grew until it was almost overwhelming. Even those who'd been sitting on the fence, who'd taken railroad money or stayed neutral through fear, found themselves pulled into the current of collective resistance. It wasn't unanimous. Lucas could see some faces that remained uncertain, some families that held back, but it was enough. It was more than enough. Hartwick looked around at the gathered crowd, and Lucas saw the exact moment he realized he'd overplayed his hand. Coming here had been meant to intimidate, to fracture the coalition through fear. Instead, it had galvanized them into something more solid than any agreement on paper. This isn't over, Hartwick said, but the threat sounded hollow now. No, Lucas agreed. It's not. But now it's a fight you can't win quietly. Now it's public and messy and exactly the kind of controversy that makes railroad investors nervous. So go back to your bosses and tell them we're not backing down. Tell them we'll fight this in every court, every newspaper, every political office that will listen. And tell them that they picked the wrong valley to try their intimidation tactics. Hartwick and his companions left without another word, and as soon as they were gone, the gathered families erupted in cheers and shouts of vindication. People clapped Lucas on the back, shook his hand, thanked him for standing firm. But Lucas's eyes found Sarah across the yard, and what he saw in her face made everything else fade into background noise. She was crying, not tears of sadness, but something else, something that looked like release or recognition, or the kind of emotion that came from watching someone finally become who they were always meant to be. Lucas moved through the crowd toward her, and when he reached her, she grabbed his hand and held on like she was anchoring herself against a storm. You did it, she said, her voice thick. You actually did it. You stood up and led them and didn't run. We did it, Lucas corrected. That speech about federal approval being revoked, that was all you. I was ready to punch Hartwick and make everything worse. Sarah laughed, the sound breaking through tears. That would have been very satisfying, but strategically terrible. They stood together while the festival resumed around them, music starting up again, children running and playing, families celebrating a victory that was more symbolic than concrete but felt desperately important anyway. And Lucas realized with startling clarity that this moment, this exact convergence of place and people and purpose, was what his father had been trying to tell him about. This was what mattered. Not the land itself, but what you did with it. Not the legacy, but who you shared it with. Not the past, but the future you chose to build from its ruins. As evening approached and lanterns were lit across the yard, Lucas found himself standing with Sarah at the edge of the celebration, watching families dance and talk, and simply exist together in a way that had felt impossible just months before. "I'm staying," Lucas said suddenly, the words coming out with the force of decision finally made. "Not because the will requires it, not because I'm afraid of disappointing people. I'm staying because this is where I'm supposed to be. Building this, fighting this, being part of something bigger than my own fear of becoming my father." Sarah turned to look at him, her eyes searching his face in the lantern light. "You're sure?" "I'm terrified," Lucas admitted, "but I'm sure. Whatever comes next, the railroad fight, building the coalition, figuring out how to run this ranch in a way that honors what my father tried to do at the end, I want to be here for it, and I want—" He stopped, the words catching because they felt too big, too important to say without absolute certainty. "What do you want?" Sarah asked softly. Lucas reached out and took her hand, his thumb tracing across her knuckles in a gesture that felt both familiar and completely new. "I want a second chance, not to go back to who we were. You're right that those people are buried and gone, but to build something new, something honest, something that acknowledges every mistake and hurt, but chooses to move forward anyway." Sarah's breath caught, her fingers tightening around his. "That's terrifying." "I know," Lucas said. "Believe me, I know. But I'm done running from things that terrify me. I'm done letting fear make my choices. So I'm asking, is there space for that? For us to try building something new, even knowing all the ways it could go wrong?" The music swelled behind them, and somewhere a child laughed with pure joy, and the valley spread out in the darkness like a promise of all the tomorrows they might have if they were brave enough to reach for them. Sarah looked at Lucas with eyes that held 6 years of pain and longing and hard-won wisdom, and he saw the moment she made her choice, saw the walls come down, saw fear step aside for possibility, saw the woman she'd become decide to trust the man he was finally allowing himself to be. "Yes," she said simply. "There's space. There's always been space, Lucas. I was just waiting for you to be ready to fill it." And standing there in the lantern light with her hand in his, and the sound of celebration all around them, Lucas finally understood what it meant to come home. Not to a place, but to a person, to a purpose, to the terrifying and beautiful work of building a life that mattered. The confrontation with the railroad had forced him to choose who he wanted to be, and Sarah's presence had given him a reason to choose bravely instead of safely. The road ahead was still uncertain, still fraught with challenges that would test everything they were trying to build. But for the first time in 6 years, Lucas felt like he was walking towards something instead of running away. And that shift, that fundamental change in direction, felt like the kind of redemption his father had been reaching for in those final years. The chance to make amends not by erasing the past, but by building a future worthy of the lessons learned from failure. The days following the festival carried a different weight than anything Lucas had experienced since returning to Red Willow Valley. It wasn't the burden of obligation or the crushing pressure of his father's legacy. It was the weight of choice freely made, of bridges built instead of burned, of standing in one place long enough to see what might grow from staying. He woke each morning in the house that had felt like a prison and found it slowly transforming into something that resembled home. Though the transformation was so gradual, he could barely mark its progress except in the small accumulations of comfort that appeared like spring flowers after winter. Sarah came to the ranch more frequently now, her visits no longer confined to coalition business or the practical necessities of neighboring landholders helping each other survive. She came for breakfast sometimes, sitting at the kitchen table with Hattie while Lucas went over the day's work assignments with his hands, her presence becoming as natural as the morning light through the windows. She came in the evenings, too, ostensibly to review documents or discuss strategy for the ongoing railroad negotiations. But their conversations drifted into territory that had nothing to do with business and everything to do with learning each other again from the ground up. They were careful with each other in ways that spoke to the depth of old wounds not quite healed. Lucas didn't push for more than Sarah was ready to give, and she didn't demand promises he wasn't certain he could keep, despite his declaration at the festival. They were building something, that much was clear, but neither of them could quite name what it was or predict where it might lead. It existed in the space between friendship and something deeper, sustained by shared purpose and the tentative trust that came from working side by side toward goals that mattered to both of them. The railroad, true to Hartwick's threats, began surveying in earnest the week after the festival. But Lucas and the coalition were ready. Every time surveyors appeared on private land without permission, riders went out immediately to document the intrusion. Pedro Ramirez had borrowed a camera from the town photographer and taught 3 of the younger men how to use it, creating visual evidence that couldn't be dismissed or explained away. Tom Winters organized a rotation of watchers who kept eyes on the most vulnerable properties, sending word the moment railroad personnel crossed boundaries they had no legal right to cross. The documentation piled up: photographs, signed statements, detailed logs of dates and times, and specific violations. Sarah compiled it all into a presentation that was simultaneously devastating in its thoroughness and elegant in its simplicity. She had a gift for taking complex legal concepts and making them accessible, for building narratives that even people with no education could understand and communicate to others. Lucas watched her work with a mixture of admiration and something deeper, seeing in her competence and determination the woman she'd become in his absence, someone who'd learned to fight not with guns or anger, but with intelligence and persistence that were far more dangerous to opponents who expected frontier people to be easily dismissed. They took their case to the territorial governor in late August, making the 2-day journey to the capital with a delegation that included Tom, Pedro, and Ben Mitchell, who'd proven surprisingly effective at presenting the coalition's position once his temper was channeled into productive advocacy instead of threats. The governor, a political animal who understood which way winds were blowing, received them with cautious interest. Railroad expansion was good for territorial development, but railroad overreach that sparked public backlash could be politically fatal. Sarah presented their documentation while Lucas stood slightly behind her, deliberately positioning her as the voice of the coalition. It was strategic. A woman speaking with authority about property rights and legal violations was unexpected enough to capture attention, memorable enough to stick in minds when decisions were being made. But it was also honest recognition of who'd done the real work of building their case into something that couldn't be ignored. The governor made no promises but assured them their concerns would be investigated. It wasn't a victory, but it wasn't a dismissal either. On the ride back to Red Willow, the delegation was cautiously optimistic, talking about next steps and contingency plans, building momentum from the sense that they were being taken seriously by people whose opinions mattered to the railroad's ability to move forward. Lucas and Sarah rode slightly apart from the others, their horses walking side by side through the late summer heat. The landscape was golden and dry, the mountains hazy in the distance, and Lucas felt a contentment he couldn't quite name settling into his bones. This was his valley now, not just by inheritance but by choice, by the work he'd put into protecting it, by the relationships he'd built with people who depended on him and whom he'd learned to depend on in return. "You were brilliant in there," Lucas said, breaking the comfortable silence between them. "The governor couldn't take his eyes off you." Sarah smiled, but there was self-consciousness in it. "I was terrified the entire time. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold the papers." "It didn't show," Lucas assured her. "You looked completely in control, like you'd been presenting legal cases to governors your entire life instead of fighting to survive on 80 acres of marginal grazing land." "I kept thinking about what your father told me once," Sarah said, her voice going soft with memory. "About how the people who win fights aren't always the strongest or the loudest. They're the ones who refuse to be silenced, who keep showing up even when it seems hopeless, who find ways to make themselves heard that can't be ignored. He said your mother taught him that persistence was a form of power all its own." Lucas felt something tighten in his chest at the mention of his mother. He'd spent so many years angry at his father for what he'd done to her, for the isolation and unhappiness that had worn her down to nothing. But Sarah was right. His mother had been persistent, had found small ways to exert influence in a household dominated by his father's iron will. She'd taught Lucas to read from books his father considered frivolous, had encouraged his love of the land in ways that went beyond mere economic utility, had planted in him seeds of empathy and awareness that had taken decades to germinate but were finally bearing fruit. "I wish she could have known you," Lucas said, "the woman you've become. She would have been proud." "I wish she could have known you," Sarah replied, "the man you're becoming. I think she'd be proud of that too." They rode in silence for a while, the weight of things unsaid sitting comfortably between them. Lucas wanted to tell her he was falling in love with her again, or maybe for the first time, since what he'd felt at 21 had been intense but untested, passion without the foundation of real understanding. What he felt now was different, built on respect and shared struggle and the daily choice to show up and be present even when it was hard. But the words felt too big, too presumptuous given that they were still finding their way back to each other across the wreckage of the past. When they reached Red Willow 2 days later, news was waiting that shifted everything. Hattie met them at the door of the ranch house, her expression grave in a way that made Lucas's stomach drop. "It's the railroad," she said without preamble. "They've filed suit against the coalition. Against you specifically, Lucas. They're claiming interference with federal commerce, conspiracy to obstruct lawful surveying, and a dozen other charges. The marshal came by this morning with papers." Lucas felt the ground shift beneath him, the careful progress they'd been making suddenly threatened by legal action that could bankrupt him personally and shatter the coalition through fear of similar prosecution. He looked at Sarah and saw his own shock and anger reflected in her face. "They're trying to make an example of me," Lucas said, the realization settling in cold and certain. "Scare everyone else into backing down by showing what happens when you fight them." "It's going to work too," Tom said grimly, having followed them into the house. "Ben's already talking about pulling out, and he's not the only one. People are scared, Lucas. They can't afford to be sued by the railroad." Sarah moved to the table and started spreading out papers, her mind already working through implications and strategies. "They're expecting us to fold. That's the entire point of this tactic. It's cheaper to file a nuisance lawsuit than to actually negotiate in good faith. They're counting on us not having the resources to fight back." "Do we?" Lucas asked bluntly. "Have the resources, I mean. Because the ranch is profitable, but not wealthy. Legal fees could drain everything my father built." "Then we don't just defend," Sarah said, her voice taking on the edge it got when she was thinking 3 moves ahead. "We attack. Countersue for harassment, for bad faith negotiation, for damages to the coalition members who've lost time and money preparing defenses against illegal surveying. Make it expensive for them, too. Make it risky enough that their investors start asking questions about why a simple land acquisition is turning into a protracted legal battle." Miguel, who'd been listening from the doorway, spoke up. "The vaqueros have a saying. When a bull charges, sometimes the smartest thing is to step aside and let him run past. Then you rope him while he's confused about why he didn't hit anything." "So we don't meet force with force," Lucas said, understanding dawning. "We make this messy and public and expensive in ways that hurt the railroad more than they hurt us." They spent the evening crafting their response, pulling in Brennan the lawyer, who proved surprisingly enthusiastic about the prospect of taking on the railroad despite the David and Goliath nature of the matchup. Word spread through the valley, and by the next morning families were showing up at the Merrick Ranch offering what they could: money, labor, testimony, anything that might help. The solidarity was overwhelming and humbling, and Lucas felt the weight of their trust settle onto his shoulders like a mantle he hadn't asked for but couldn't refuse. The lawsuit dragged through September and into October, a grinding battle of depositions and filings and legal maneuvering that tested everyone's patience and reserves. Lucas found himself spending long hours with Brennan preparing testimony, documenting every interaction with the railroad, building their countersuit into something with teeth. Sarah was his constant companion through it all, her organizational skills and attention to detail proving invaluable, her presence keeping him grounded when the stress threatened to overwhelm him. They worked late into the nights in his father's study, the room that had once felt like enemy territory now transformed into the war room where they plotted strategy against opponents who had more money and more power, but perhaps less determination. It was during one of these late sessions, with papers scattered across every surface and exhaustion pulling at both of them, that Sarah finally asked the question Lucas had been avoiding. "What happens if we lose?" she said quietly, setting down the document she'd been reviewing. "If the railroad wins, if you're found liable for damages you can't pay, what happens to the ranch, to everything we've been building?" Lucas leaned back in his chair and rubbed his eyes, the weight of potential failure pressing down on him. "I'd have to sell, probably to the railroad at whatever price they offered, which would be insulting and insufficient and exactly what they want. The coalition would collapse without leadership and resources. Everyone would end up accepting individual settlements that benefit the railroad and leave the valley permanently changed. And us? Sarah asked, her voice barely above a whisper. What happens to us if everything falls apart? Lucas looked at her across the cluttered desk, seeing the fear in her eyes that mirrored his own. They'd been dancing around this question for months, building something fragile and precious without naming it, afraid that speaking it aloud might shatter whatever they were creating. But the lawsuit had forced a reckoning. If he lost everything, if he had to leave the valley again, where would that leave them? I don't know, Lucas admitted. I want to say we'd figure it out together, that we'd find a way regardless of what happens with the ranch. But Sarah, I'm barely holding on here. I'm trying to be the man you deserve, the man who stays and fights and doesn't run when things get hard. But if I lose everything, if I fail these people who've trusted me, if I can't protect what my father spent his life building, I don't know who I'll be on the other side of that. Sarah stood and came around the desk, moving into Lucas's space in a way that was both intimate and careful, respecting boundaries even as she pushed against them. Then we make sure you don't have to find out. We fight this with everything we have, and we don't let them break us. Not separately, not together. Lucas reached for her hand, pulling her closer until she was standing between his knees, her fingers threading through his hair in a gesture that was becoming familiar, that spoke to comfort and connection neither of them had allowed themselves in far too long. I'm scared, he confessed, not just of losing, but of letting you down, of proving that I'm still the same person who ran away 6 years ago, just wearing a different face. You're not, Sarah said firmly. That person wouldn't be here, wouldn't be fighting, wouldn't have organized an entire valley to stand against something that seemed impossible. You're different, Lucas. I've watched you become different. And even if we lose, even if everything falls apart, that doesn't erase who you've proven yourself to be. Lucas pulled her into his lap, the movement natural and unplanned, driven by a need for closeness that transcended the careful boundaries they'd maintained. Sarah came willingly, settling against him with a sigh that sounded like relief, like she'd been waiting for permission to stop being so careful, to acknowledge that what existed between them was more than partnership or friendship or any other safe label they'd been hiding behind. I love you, Lucas said, the words escaping before he could analyze them, before fear could cage them. Not the way I loved you when we were young. That was real, but it was also selfish and incomplete. I love you now in a way that understands what it costs, what it requires, what it means to choose someone every day, instead of just once in a moment of passion. And I know I haven't earned the right to say it, haven't proven I can be trusted with something that precious. But it's true anyway, and I'm done pretending it's not. Sarah was very still in his arms, her breath catching in a way that might have been a sob or a laugh or something in between. When she finally spoke, her voice was thick with emotion. I love you too. I've been trying not to, trying to protect myself from getting hurt again. But loving you isn't something I can control or prevent. It just is, like breathing, like waking up every morning and deciding to keep going even when it's hard. They kissed then, finally, the gesture both tentative and desperate, tasting like forgiveness and promise and all the things they'd denied themselves, while trying to be cautious and smart and protected from pain. It was different from the kisses Lucas remembered from 6 years ago. Less frantic, more grounded, informed by loss and maturity, and the understanding that passion alone wasn't enough to sustain love through the trials that would inevitably come. When they finally pulled apart, Sarah was crying silently, tears tracking down her cheeks in the lamplight. Lucas wiped them away with his thumbs, his own eyes burning with emotion he hadn't allowed himself to feel in too long. I want to marry you, he said, the declaration coming out rough and unpolished, nothing like the romantic proposal she probably deserved. Not because it's what we should have done 6 years ago, not to fix the past or honor the dead. I want to marry you because I choose this. Choose us. Choose building a life that's honest and shared and worth the fear it takes to commit to someone completely. Sarah's breath hitched, her hands clutching at his shirt like she was anchoring herself against a storm. Ask me when we win, she said. When the lawsuit is over and we know what our future looks like. Ask me then, and I'll say yes. But I need to know we're choosing each other from a place of strength, not desperation or fear of loss. Lucas understood what she was asking for, the assurance that they were building on solid ground rather than sand, that their love could withstand not just hardship, but also success, that they weren't just clinging to each other in crisis, but choosing partnership in clear-eyed awareness of what that meant. It was wise and terrifying in equal measure, and Lucas loved her more for having the strength to demand it. "Then we'll win," he said simply, "because losing isn't an option anymore." The trial date was set for early November, giving them 6 weeks to prepare their defense and countersuits. Lucas threw himself into the work with renewed determination, bolstered by Sarah's love and the coalition's continued support despite mounting pressure from the railroad's legal tactics. They gathered more evidence, recruited expert witnesses who could testify to the railroad's pattern of overreach in other territories, built a narrative that was impossible to dismiss as simple frontier stubbornness interfering with progress. The railroad fought back hard, as expected. They filed motions to dismiss, challenged the standing of coalition members to intervene in the lawsuit, threatened secondary suits against anyone who testified on Lucas's behalf. But for every tactic they employed, Sarah found a counter-strategy. She'd been studying law through correspondence with lawyers in the territorial capital, teaching herself the language and procedures that might help them survive this fight. And her preparation was paying off in ways that frustrated the railroad's attorneys visibly. Ben Mitchell, who'd been wavering about staying in the coalition, showed up at the ranch one evening with his eldest son and a case of whiskey. "Heard the railroad threaten to sue anyone who testifies for you," he said without preamble. "Figured I'd come tell you I'll be there anyway. And if they want to sue me too, well, I've got nothing they can take that I'm not willing to lose." Similar declarations came from other families: Maria Ramirez, the Hendersons, even Widow Henshaw, who had no land at risk but plenty of opinions about railroad bullies. The solidarity was building into something powerful enough to worry the railroad's leadership. Lucas could tell from the increasingly desperate nature of their legal filings and the rumors filtering back from the territorial capital about investor concerns over the bad publicity. 2 weeks before the trial, Sarah moved the last of her essential belongings to the Merrick Ranch. It wasn't a formal arrangement, wasn't accompanied by declarations or announcements. It simply made sense. They were working together constantly. The distance between properties was inefficient, and Hattie had been pushing for it anyway, with the kind of maternal insistence that was hard to argue against. Sarah took one of the upstairs rooms, maintaining separate quarters in deference to propriety and their own need to move at a pace that felt right rather than rushed. But the night she came to Lucas's room, the mornings they woke tangled together in sheets that smelled like both of them, the easy domesticity of breakfast conversations and shared silence. These became the foundation of something that felt more permanent than any legal document or social convention. They were building a life together, one small choice at a time, creating patterns and rituals that spoke to commitment even as they waited for circumstances to align enough to make that commitment official. Hattie watched it all with satisfaction barely concealed, occasionally making comments about grandbabies and wedding dates that made both Lucas and Sarah blush like teenagers. But there was joy in her teasing, relief that the house, which had been so silent and grief-stricken for so many years, was finally filled with life and laughter and the sound of two people learning to be happy together. The night before the trial, Lucas couldn't sleep. He stood at his bedroom window, staring out at the valley bathed in moonlight, thinking about his father and the letter that had started all of this. Josiah Merrick had tried to make amends at the end, had recognized his mistakes, and attempted to correct them through generosity and changed behavior. But he'd never gotten the chance to see if his efforts bore fruit, never knew if the seeds he planted would grow into something that justified the pain of his earlier choices. Lucas understood now what his father had been trying to tell him, that legacy wasn't about land or money or even the Merrick name continuing through generations. Legacy was about the lives you touched, the community you built, the love you chose despite fear and pride, and all the ways that opening yourself to others could lead to hurt. His father had learned that lesson too late to fully apply it, but he'd learned it nonetheless, and he'd tried to pass that wisdom forward through a letter and a series of obligations designed to force Lucas to stay long enough to understand. Sarah appeared in the doorway, silhouetted by lamplight from the hall, wearing one of Lucas's shirts over her nightdress. "Can't sleep either?" "Too much thinking," Lucas admitted. "About tomorrow. About what we stand to lose if this goes wrong." Sarah crossed to the window and wrapped her arms around him from behind, her cheek pressed against his back. Then think about what we stand to gain when it goes right. Think about the future we'll build, the family we'll raise, the life that starts on the other side of tomorrow's testimony. You're assuming we win. I'm choosing to believe we win, Sarah corrected, because the alternative is unacceptable, and I'm done letting fear make my decisions. We walk into that courtroom tomorrow and we tell the truth about the railroad's overreach, about the coalition's legitimacy, about communities deserving protection from corporate interests that see them as obstacles instead of people. And then we trust that truth is powerful enough to matter. Lucas turned in her arms and held her close, breathing in the scent of her hair, feeling the steady beat of her heart against his chest. Tomorrow would bring what it brought, victory or devastation, vindication or ruin. But tonight, he had this. Sarah in his arms, love freely given and received, the choice to stand and fight instead of running made real through months of action that proved it wasn't just words. Whatever happens, Lucas said quietly, I want you to know that these months since I came home, they've been the most important of my life. Not because of the ranch or the coalition or even defeating the railroad, because of you, because of learning who I could be when I stopped running from the things that scared me. Sarah pulled back just enough to look at his face, her eyes bright with tears and love and determination that matched his own. Whatever happens tomorrow, we face it together. That's what partnership means, Lucas. Not just the good times, but the hard ones too. Not just success, but also the possibility of failure and the commitment to rebuild from it if we have to. They stood together at the window as night deepened toward dawn, two people who'd lost each other once and found their way back through pain and growth, and the stubborn refusal to let past mistakes define their future. And Lucas felt something settle in his chest that might have been peace, or might have been certainty, or might have been simply the recognition that he was exactly where he was supposed to be, with exactly who he was supposed to be with, facing exactly the kind of challenge that would prove whether everything they'd built was strong enough to last. Tomorrow would bring the trial, would bring testimony and cross-examination and legal arguments that would determine the fate of the ranch and the coalition and the valley itself. But tonight, Lucas had already won the thing that mattered most. He'd found his way home, not to a place but to a person, and he'd learned that love without fear was possible if you were brave enough to choose it despite every reason the world gave you not to. The rest would follow from that foundation, or it wouldn't. But either way, Lucas knew he wouldn't face it alone. And that knowledge, that certainty born of shared struggle and earned trust, was worth more than all the land in Red Willow Valley. Dawn came cold and clear on the day of the trial, the kind of November morning that promised winter wasn't far behind. Lucas dressed carefully in his father's best suit, the fabric smelling faintly of cedar and the past, his hands steady despite the anxiety coiling in his gut. Sarah met him in the hallway wearing a dress the color of midnight blue, her hair pinned up in a style that made her look older, more severe, ready for battle in a courtroom instead of on open land. They didn't speak as they walked downstairs together, but their hands found each other, fingers interlacing in a grip that spoke of solidarity and shared fear and the determination to face whatever came next as a united front. Hattie had breakfast waiting, though neither of them had much appetite. She fussed over them like a mother sending children off to war, adjusting Lucas's collar, tucking a strand of hair behind Sarah's ear, her eyes bright with unshed tears she was too proud to let fall. Your father would be proud, she said to Lucas, her voice thick. Not of the lawsuit or the fight with the railroad, but of the man you've become through it. That's what matters, boy. Whatever happens in that courtroom today, you've already won the thing he spent his whole life searching for. Lucas embraced her, this woman who'd been more mother to him than employee, who'd held the household together through grief and anger, and all the years of masculine stubbornness that had nearly destroyed the Merrick family. Thank you, he said simply, for everything, for staying, for believing I could be better than I was. The ride to the territorial capital took most of the morning, their wagon joined by others from the coalition, Tom and Miguel riding alongside, Pedro and Maria Ramirez in their own wagon with their children, Ben Mitchell with his sons, Widow Henshaw sitting ramrod straight beside Catherine Mitchell like a general reviewing troops before battle. By the time they reached the courthouse, They'd gathered into a procession that drew stares from townspeople and whispered speculation about what kind of case could bring so many frontier families into the civilized corridors of territorial justice. The courtroom was already packed when they arrived, filled with railroad representatives in expensive suits, journalists with notebooks ready to document whatever drama unfolded, curious locals drawn by rumors of a David and Goliath confrontation that might reshape how corporations dealt with territorial expansion. Judge Aldrich presided, a man in his 60s with silver hair and a reputation for fairness that gave Lucas hope, even as Hartwick's legal team spread documents across their table with the confidence of people who'd never lost a case they cared about winning. Brennan looked nervous but determined as he reviewed his notes one final time, occasionally leaning over to whisper last-minute strategy to Lucas and Sarah. The countersuit they'd filed was ambitious, claiming harassment, bad faith negotiation, and damages that totaled more than the ranch was worth, but reflected the true cost of the railroad's intimidation tactics across the entire valley. It was a gamble, an aggressive stance that would either vindicate them completely or result in crushing defeat that left them worse off than if they'd simply accepted the railroad's original offers. Judge Aldrich called the court to order with a strike of his gavel, and the proceedings began with opening statements that laid bare the fundamental disagreement at the heart of the case. The railroad painted Lucas and the coalition as obstructionists standing in the way of progress, selfish landholders unwilling to accept fair compensation for easements that would benefit the entire territory. Hartwick spoke eloquently about manifest destiny and economic development, making it sound as if the coalition was trying to hold back the tide of history itself through petty grievances and frontier stubbornness. Then Brennan stood, and Lucas felt Sarah's hand tighten on his knee under the table. The lawyer's opening was quieter, less theatrical, but it carried weight that came from truth rather than rhetoric. He spoke about property rights and the rule of law, about communities that had built lives in harsh territory and deserved protection from corporate interests that saw them as obstacles rather than people. He spoke about the railroad's pattern of overreach, documented in 3 other territories where similar tactics had resulted in legal sanctions and forced restitution. And he spoke about Josiah Merrick's transformation in his final years, a man who'd learned too late that land meant nothing without the community to share it with, whose last acts had been attempts to build bridges the railroad was now trying to burn. The testimony began with technical witnesses, surveyors and land assessors and legal experts who argued about jurisdiction and procedure in language so dense it made Lucas's head ache. But then Sarah took the stand, and the entire dynamic of the courtroom shifted. Hartwick's lead attorney, a sharp-faced man named Colson, approached her with barely concealed condescension, clearly expecting to rattle a frontier woman unused to formal interrogation. "Mrs. Caldwell," Colson began, his tone suggesting he was speaking to a child. "You claim the railroad conducted illegal surveys on your property. Can you explain to the court how you, with no legal training, determined these surveys were unlawful?" Sarah met his gaze without flinching. "I determined they were unlawful because they occurred without permission, without notification, and in direct violation of territorial statutes that require written consent before private land can be accessed for commercial surveying purposes. I've read those statutes, Mr. Colson. Have you?" A ripple of surprised laughter ran through the courtroom, quickly silenced by Judge Aldrich's stern look. Colson's expression tightened. "And you expect this court to believe that a widow running a small cattle operation has expertise in territorial law? I expect this court to believe that a woman with everything to lose pays attention to the laws that protect her rights," Sarah replied calmly. "Unlike railroad attorneys who apparently assume ignorance is universal among people who work with their hands." Colson tried different approaches, attempting to paint Sarah as vindictive or financially motivated, or simply confused about what she'd witnessed. But every attempt hit the wall of her preparation and her refusal to be intimidated. She had dates, times, names of specific railroad employees who'd been on her land without authorization. She had photographs that showed survey markers placed on private property. She had testimony from neighbors who'd witnessed similar violations. And she presented it all with a composure that made it clear she wasn't just defending herself. She was speaking for everyone the railroad had tried to bully into submission. When she finally stepped down from the witness stand, Lucas saw tears in Maria Ramirez's eyes and fierce pride on Tom Winter's face. Sarah had done more than testify effectively. She'd shown the court and everyone watching that the coalition wasn't a collection of ignorant frontier folk easy to dismiss, but rather organized citizens who understood their rights and were willing to fight for them intelligently. Lucas took the stand next, and the questioning was more aggressive, more personal. Coulson clearly saw him as the weak point, the man who'd abandoned his family and only returned when forced by a will, whose motivations could be questioned and whose character could be undermined. The attorney dug into Lucas's 6 years away, suggesting he'd been running from responsibility, implying his sudden interest in protecting the valley was financially motivated rather than principled. "Mr. Merrick," Coulson said with false sympathy, "isn't it true that you had no interest in this land or these people until you discovered you stood to inherit a substantial property? Isn't this entire lawsuit simply about protecting your unexpected windfall rather than any genuine concern for your neighbors?" Lucas took a breath, feeling the weight of truth pressing against his ribs. "I came back planning to sell and leave," he admitted, and he heard the courtroom go still with attention. "My father and I parted on terrible terms. I blamed him for destroying my chance at happiness, and I spent 6 years running from that anger. So yes, when I got the telegram about his death, my first thought was signing papers and escaping again." "Then what changed?" Coulson pressed, clearly thinking he'd found the opening he needed. "I found out who my father had become," Lucas said quietly. "I learned that he'd spent his final years trying to make amends for the damage his pride had caused. I saw how he'd helped people like Mrs. Caldwell survive when they had nowhere else to turn. I read a letter where he admitted his mistakes and begged me not to make the same ones. And I realized that running away had made me exactly like him at his worst. Isolated, bitter, hurting people I loved because I was too afraid to face my own fear." Lucas looked at Sarah, finding her eyes across the courtroom, drawing strength from her steady gaze. "What changed was I stopped running. I stayed long enough to see that these people, this community, they matter more than my fear or my comfort or my desire to avoid anything that reminds me of past pain. The railroad wants to paint us as obstructionists, but we're not trying to stop progress. We're trying to ensure that progress doesn't steamroll over the lives of people who've built something valuable in hard country. That's worth fighting for, even if it costs me everything I inherited." The questioning continued, but Lucas felt the shift in the courtroom, the way his honesty had complicated Coulson's narrative. You couldn't easily dismiss someone who admitted his flaws, who acknowledged that his motivations weren't pure from the beginning, but had evolved through genuine connection to place and people. It was messy and human, and Judge Aldrich was paying attention with an intensity that suggested he was seeing past the legal arguments to the human reality beneath. The trial stretched across 3 days, each side presenting witnesses and evidence, arguments and counterarguments building into a complex picture of competing rights and priorities. The railroad brought in economic experts who testified about the benefits of expansion, the jobs and commerce that would flow into the territory if the northern route was approved. The coalition countered with environmental specialists who explained how the proposed route would disrupt watersheds that sustain not just livestock, but entire ecosystems, with testimonies from families who described in painful detail how railroad construction in other regions had destroyed their livelihoods and communities. On the final day, Ben Mitchell took the stand, and Lucas held his breath as the volatile rancher faced Coulson's cross-examination. But Mitchell surprised everyone by speaking with controlled passion about his son Pedro, about watching a young man return from war broken in body but not spirit, about building a life that accommodated disability and still had dignity and purpose. He described the railroad surveyors on his land, the casual disrespect they'd shown for property he'd defended with a shotgun, only because no one else seemed willing to defend it with law. "You want to know why I pointed a gun at those men?" Mitchell said, his voice rough with emotion. "Because they were treating my land like it didn't matter, like I didn't matter, like the work my family's put into this valley for 30 years could be erased with some papers filed in an office hundreds of miles away. I was wrong to threaten violence. I know that now. But I wasn't wrong about the disrespect. I wasn't wrong about feeling like we were being treated as obstacles instead of people." By the time closing arguments began, Lucas felt wrung out emotionally, exhausted from the intensity of laying bare his life and motivations for public scrutiny. Brennan's summation was powerful, weaving together all the evidence they'd presented into a narrative about property rights and corporate responsibility and the need for law to protect the vulnerable rather than simply empower the already powerful. Hartwick's closing was equally strong, emphasizing economic necessity and the railroad's legal authority and the danger of allowing individual landholders to veto projects that benefited the broader community. Judge Aldrich announced he would take the case under advisement and deliver his ruling in 1 week, then dismissed the court with instructions that both parties refrain from any contact with potential witnesses or media until the decision was rendered. Lucas walked out of the courthouse into the late afternoon sun, feeling like he'd been through a war, every nerve raw, every emotion scraped clean and exposed. Sarah found him on the courthouse steps, and they stood together watching as the coalition members dispersed to find lodging or begin the journey home. No one knew what to say. The trial had been as good as they could have hoped, but that meant nothing if the judge ruled against them. The railroad had vast resources to appeal any unfavorable decision, and the coalition was already stretched thin financially from fighting this far. "We did everything we could," Sarah said quietly, slipping her hand into Lucas's. "Whatever happens now is out of our control." "I hate that," Lucas admitted. "Hate waiting for someone else to decide our future." "Then let's not wait," Sarah said, turning to face him with sudden determination. "Let's go home. Let's work the ranch and tend the cattle and live our lives like we already know we're going to win. Because if we spend the next week paralyzed by fear, the railroad wins even if the judge rules in our favor." They made the journey back to Red Willow that night, arriving at the ranch well after midnight to find Hattie waiting with hot coffee and quiet understanding. The week that followed was strange. Surface normalcy covering deep anxiety, everyone going through the motions of daily work while constantly wondering what news the next mail delivery might bring. Lucas threw himself into ranch operations with almost desperate focus, fixing fence lines that didn't really need fixing, reorganizing tack rooms that were already organized. Anything to keep his hands busy and his mind from spinning endless scenarios of victory and defeat. Sarah worked beside him, matching his frantic energy with her own, and they barely spoke about the trial or the verdict or what they would do if everything fell apart. Instead, they talked about small things, what to plant in next year's garden, whether the barn needed a new roof before winter, plans for expanding the herd if circumstances allowed. They were building a future in conversation even as that future remained desperately uncertain. On the 6th day, Lucas found himself alone in his father's study, sorting through papers that probably didn't need sorting, when he came across a box he'd overlooked before. Inside were letters, dozens of them, addressed to him over the years, never sent. His father had written to him regularly after Lucas left, pouring out confessions and apologies and updates about the valley, creating a one-sided conversation with a son who'd never received the messages. Lucas read them with tears streaming down his face, seeing the evolution of Josiah Merrick from angry patriarch to grieving father to humbled man seeking redemption he knew he might never receive. The final letter was dated a week before his father's death, the handwriting shaky but still legible. It said simply, "I understand now that love requires courage I never possessed until it was too late. Don't wait as long as I did, son. Whatever you're afraid of, it's not as frightening as the regret you'll carry if you let fear make your choices. Choose bravely. Choose love. Choose the life that scares you because it matters too much to lose." Lucas was still sitting with those letters when Sarah found him, and she didn't ask questions, just pulled him into her arms and held him while he grieved for the father he'd lost and the relationship they might have had if either of them had been brave enough to bend before breaking. The verdict arrived on the 7th day, delivered by special courier who rode out to the ranch rather than making them wait for regular mail. Lucas's hands shook as he broke the seal on the official envelope. Sarah pressed against his side, reading over his shoulder. Hattie and Tom and Miguel gathered close enough to see their faces and know immediately what the news would be. Judge Aldrich had ruled in their favor on every major point. The railroad's suit against Lucas was dismissed with prejudice, meaning they couldn't refile the same charges. The countersuit was partially successful. The judge stopped short of awarding full damages, but issued significant fines against the railroad for unlawful surveying and bad faith negotiation, money that would be distributed among the coalition members who'd been affected. And most importantly, the judge issued an injunction blocking the northern route until the railroad could demonstrate genuine community consent and prove they'd followed all legal requirements for land acquisition. It wasn't total victory, The railroad could still build eventually if they played by the rules, but it was vindication, validation that the coalition's fight had been justified, and that corporate power wasn't unlimited when opposed by organized citizens willing to stand up for their rights. Lucas felt something break open in his chest, relief and joy, and the overwhelming sense that maybe, finally, things were going to be okay. Sarah was crying and laughing at the same time, and Hattie was hugging them both. And Tom was shaking his head in disbelief while Miguel murmured prayers in Spanish. Word spread through the valley with the speed that only good news can travel. And by evening, the ranch was filled with coalition members celebrating, sharing food and whiskey, and the hard-won satisfaction of having fought impossible odds and survived. Lucas found Ben Mitchell standing alone near the corrals, staring out at the darkening valley with an expression Lucas couldn't quite read. He joined the older man in silence, both of them watching as stars emerged in the vast Montana sky. "Your father was right," Mitchell said finally, "about community being stronger than individual stubbornness. I didn't believe it when he tried to tell me years ago. Thought a man stood alone or he fell, but standing alone, that's just another way of falling, isn't it? Just takes longer." "Yeah," Lucas agreed quietly. "That's what I'm learning too." Mitchell turned to look at him, and in the dim light, Lucas saw something like respect in the older man's face. "You're not your father, Merrick. You're better. He learned his lessons too late. You learned them young enough to matter." The celebration went long into the night, but eventually people drifted home, leaving Lucas and Sarah alone on the porch of the main house, wrapped in blankets against the November cold, watching as the last wagons disappeared down the road. The valley was quiet again, peaceful in a way it hadn't been since Lucas had returned, as if the land itself was exhaling after months of held breath. "So," Sarah said, snuggling closer against his side. "We won." "We won," Lucas confirmed, still not quite believing it. "And the year is almost up. Your father's requirement. You've fulfilled it. You're free to leave if you want to." Lucas knew what she was asking, the question beneath the words. He pulled away slightly so he could see her face, illuminated by lamplight from inside the house, beautiful and familiar and absolutely everything he wanted. "I'm not leaving," he said firmly. "Not ever. This is my home, you're my home, and I'm done running from anything that matters." He stood and pulled her to her feet, then dropped to one knee right there on the porch, where his father had stood for decades watching the valley change with the seasons. "Sarah Caldwell, I'm asking you now like I should have asked you 6 years ago, except this time I'm asking as a man who understands what he's asking for. Will you marry me? Will you build this life with me, run this ranch with me, raise a family with me? Will you let me spend the rest of my days proving that staying is more powerful than running, that love without fear is possible, that choosing you is the easiest and best decision I'll ever make?" Sarah was crying again, but smiling so wide it looked like her face might break from joy. "Yes," she said, pulling him to his feet and kissing him with a passion that made Lucas forget the cold, forget everything except the woman in his arms, and the future stretching out before them like an open road. "Yes to all of it. Yes to marriage and partnership and the life we'll build together. Yes to everything, Lucas. Always yes." They were married in the spring, on the same ridge where Lucas had first seen Sarah working her land after he returned. The valley spread out below them like a benediction. The entire community came, coalition members and townsfolk, old friends, and former enemies who'd learned to put aside grudges for the greater good. Hattie cried through the entire ceremony, and Tom served as Lucas's best man, and Maria Ramirez sang a song in Spanish about love that survives hardship and emerges stronger. Sarah wore a dress the color of cream, simple and elegant, her hair crowned with wildflowers that Lucas had picked that morning from the meadow where they'd kissed for the first time a lifetime ago. He wore his father's suit again, but this time it didn't feel like wearing a dead man's clothes. It felt like honoring a legacy while building something new, acknowledging the past while refusing to be bound by it. When the Reverend pronounced them married, Lucas kissed his wife with the sun warm on their faces and the entire valley bearing witness, and he felt something settle deep in his chest that might have been peace or might have been simple happiness at finally being exactly where he was supposed to be. The reception lasted until dawn, music and dancing and celebration that felt less like a wedding and more like a community affirming its own survival and cohesion. The railroad had eventually backed down completely. choosing a southern route that avoided the coalition's lands entirely, and the victory had created bonds between families that might last generations. They toasted Lucas and Sarah, but they also toasted themselves, their own courage and persistence and willingness to stand together when standing alone would have been easier. As the sun rose over the eastern mountains, painting the valley in shades of gold and rose, Lucas and Sarah stood together at the edge of the celebration, watching their community slowly disperse, heading home to lives that felt more secure than they had in years. Sarah's hand rested on her belly, though she hadn't told anyone yet about the baby she was carrying, the new life that would be born into the legacy they were building from the ashes of old mistakes. "Your father would be proud," Sarah said softly, echoing Hattie's words from months before. "I think he'd be surprised," Lucas replied. Proud, but surprised. He never imagined love could be this simple, choosing each other day after day without the complications of pride or fear making it harder than it needs to be. "It's not always simple," Sarah corrected gently, "but it's always worth it. That's what he learned too late and what we learned just in time." Lucas pulled her close, breathing in the scent of wildflowers and the dawn air, and the particular perfume that was uniquely Sarah. "I love you," he said, the words still new enough to carry weight, still precious enough to be spoken with intention rather than habit. "I love this life we're building. I love that our child will grow up knowing that staying and fighting for what matters is possible, that community is stronger than isolation, that choosing love over fear is always the brave choice." "Our child will be lucky," Sarah agreed, her voice thick with emotion, "to grow up in a valley that learned to stand together, to have parents who chose each other freely, not because they were forced by circumstance, but because they wanted the life they could build together, to inherit land that means something beyond just acres and property lines." They stood together as the celebration ended and the new day began. Two people who'd been given a second chance and had chosen to use it wisely, building not back toward what had been lost, but forward into something better, something earned through struggle and sacrifice, and the daily choice to show up for each other in the community they'd helped forge from fractured pieces. The ranch prospered over the years that followed, growing beyond what Josiah Merrick had built into something that supported multiple families and served as a model for cooperative ranching that other valleys studied and emulated. Lucas and Sarah had 3 children, 2 daughters and a son, who grew up strong and stubborn and kind, learning from their parents' example that love and work and community were the foundations of any life worth living. The coalition evolved into a regional organization that protected landholders' rights across 3 territories, setting precedents that would influence Western development for generations. Sarah served as its director, her reputation for intelligence and fierce advocacy growing until she was consulting with territorial governors and railroad executives who'd learned it was smarter to negotiate with her than to try running over her. Lucas ran the ranch with a management style that combined his father's practical knowledge with the openness to innovation and partnership that Josiah had never possessed. He brought in new breeding stock, implemented water management systems that benefited his neighbors as much as his own operation, and created profit-sharing arrangements with his hands that turned employees into genuine stakeholders in the ranch's success. But more than the professional achievements or the financial prosperity or the respected name they built in the valley and beyond, what Lucas treasured most were the small moments that accumulated into a life fully lived. Sarah's laugh over morning coffee, his daughters racing their horses across meadows his father had once jealously guarded, his son learning to work cattle with the same patient guidance Tom Winters had once shown Lucas, evenings on the porch with the woman he'd chosen and who'd chosen him back, watching sunsets paint their valley in colors that never got old no matter how many times they witnessed them together. Years later, when Lucas was in his 60s and his children were grown and building their own lives, he stood on the same ridge where he'd married Sarah, where he'd first returned to see her struggling alone on land his father had secretly protected. The valley looked different now, more settled, more connected, marked by progress that had been allowed in on terms the community controlled rather than terms imposed from outside. The railroad ran through the southern section, bringing commerce and visitors, but not the destruction they'd all feared. The northern valley remained largely untouched, a testament to what organized citizens could preserve when they stood together. Sarah joined him on the ridge, her hair silver now, but her eyes still the same green that had captured him as a boy, and held him as a man. They didn't speak, comfortable in the silence that came from decades of partnership and shared purpose, but their hands found each other with the automatic certainty of long practice. "Do you ever regret it?" Sarah asked finally, her voice curious rather than worried. "Coming back, staying, choosing this life over the freedom you had when you were drifting." Lucas thought about the question seriously, honoring it with genuine consideration rather than reflexive reassurance. He thought about the years of hard work, the struggles and setbacks, the weight of responsibility that came from being rooted in place and community. He thought about the ways that choosing Sarah and the ranch had limited his options, had required sacrifice and compromise and daily recommitment to paths chosen rather than roads not taken. "No," he said finally, and the word carried absolute certainty. "Not for a single moment. That freedom I thought I had, it was just another word for loneliness. Another word for running from anything that required courage or commitment or the risk of being hurt. This life we built, it's been harder than drifting ever was. But it's been real in ways that nothing before it was real. It's been worth every sacrifice, every struggle, every moment of fear that it might not work out." "Good," Sarah said, squeezing his hand, "because I've never regretted choosing you either. Not when you first left and I thought I'd lost you forever. Not when you came back and we had to learn each other all over again. Not in any of the years since. You were always worth waiting for, Lucas Merrick, always worth the risk." They stood together on the ridge as the sun began its descent, painting the valley in familiar gold and amber, and Lucas felt the weight of his father's legacy sitting lightly on his shoulders now, transformed from burden into gift through the alchemy of time and understanding and the grace of being given a second chance he'd almost been too afraid to take. Josiah Merrick had learned his lessons too late to fully apply them, but he'd learned them nonetheless, and he'd passed them forward through a letter and a series of obligations designed to force his son to stay long enough to understand. And Lucas had learned. He'd learned that land meant nothing without people to share it with, that legacy was measured in relationships rather than acres, that love required courage he'd had to grow into, but that the growing was itself worthwhile. He'd learned that staying was harder than leaving, but that the difficulty was what gave it value. That choosing the same person and place and purpose day after day was how you built something that lasted beyond yourself. The valley spread out before them, marked by their labor and shaped by their choices, home to generations that would follow and inherit not just property, but also the lesson that community and courage and commitment were what transformed land into legacy. And Lucas knew, with the certainty that came from a life fully lived in one place with one person, that he'd finally found what his father had spent his entire life searching for. A peace that came not from conquest or control, but from the simple, profound act of choosing love over fear and standing firm in that choice, no matter what storms might come. "Let's go home," Sarah said softly, and Lucas turned from the view to look at his wife, the woman who'd once stolen his heart and had spent the decades since proving she knew exactly what to do with something so precious. "Our grandchildren are coming for dinner, and I want to tell them the story of how their grandparents fell in love twice. Once when they were too young to know what to do with it, and again when they were old enough to choose it wisely." "That's a good story," Lucas agreed, pulling her close for a kiss that tasted like 50 years of shared mornings and hard-won joy. "One of the best stories I know." They walked down from the ridge together, hand in hand, heading home to the house that had been a fortress and then a prison, and finally, through patient transformation, a place of love and laughter and the ordinary miracles that comprised a life well lived. And as they walked, Lucas thought about his father's final letter, the wisdom that had come too late for Josiah, but just in time for his son. "Choose bravely, choose love, choose the life that scares you, because it matters too much to lose." He'd chosen. And in choosing, he'd found everything he'd been running from, and everything he'd been running toward had always been the same thing: home, in all its complexity and challenge and unexpected grace. The cowboy who'd left to escape his father's shadow had returned to settle his father's land, and found not just the widow who'd stolen his heart, but also himself, finally complete, finally at peace, finally exactly where he was meant to be all along.